I interrogated an alien who claimed to have witnessed Lucifer's fall. His words still haunt me. Look, I need you to understand something right off the bat. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in UFOs or little green men or any of that conspiracy theory garbage you see on late-night TV. I was a staff sergeant in the United States Army, trained interrogator, certified in advanced behavioral analysis. I spent 3 tours in Syria getting insurgents to talk, and I was damn good at my job. I say was, because after what I'm about to tell you, well, let's just say I don't work for the government anymore. And honestly, I'm not even sure I want to be on this planet anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, the night that changed everything. It was 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday when my phone rang. I remember the exact time because I'd just looked at my clock, couldn't sleep, thinking about a girl I'd been seeing who'd stopped returning my texts. The number on my screen wasn't one I recognized, just a string of zeros with a 703 area code. Northern Virginia. That's where a lot of government agencies hide their phone systems, and when you've been in the game as long as I had, you learn to recognize the signs. My stomach dropped before I even answered. Calls like this, at this hour, they're never good news. I picked up, didn't say anything at first, just listened to the silence on the other end. Then a voice, calm and professional, the kind of voice that's used to being obeyed. Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway, confirm identity with your service number. I rattled it off automatically, still half asleep, wondering if this was about some paperwork I'd forgotten to file. You are to report to Andrews Air Force Base by 0400 hours. A vehicle is already en route to your location. Pack light, 72 hours minimum, possibly extended. This is a classified transfer, code Black Priority. I sat up in bed, suddenly very awake. Code Black meant above top secret, the kind of classification that doesn't officially exist. Transfer to where? I asked, already knowing I wouldn't get a real answer. That information will be provided upon arrival. The vehicle will be at your location in 40 minutes. Be ready, Sergeant. And Holloway, don't make any calls. Don't text anyone. Don't tell anyone where you're going. As of this moment, you're on complete communications blackout. The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, phone still pressed to my ear, my heart pounding in a way it hadn't since my last firefight in Aleppo. 40 minutes to pack for God knows what, going God knows where, for God knows how long. I'm not gonna lie to you. My hands were shaking as I threw clothes into my duffel bag. Combat boots, tactical pants, a few t-shirts, basic toiletries. My brain was running through possibilities. Had I screwed something up? Was I being investigated? Court-martialed? But no, they wouldn't send a car for that. They'd send MPs. This was something else, something operational. I grabbed my go bag from the closet, the one I'd kept packed since my first deployment. Old habits die hard. Extra socks, first aid kit, water purification tablets, things you learn to keep handy when you've seen enough shit go sideways. I looked around my apartment one last time, at the half-empty beer on my coffee table, the dirty dishes in the sink, the normal mundane evidence of a normal mundane life. Something told me it was going to be a while before I saw this place again. I didn't know then just how right I was. The black SUV pulled up exactly 40 minutes later, silent as a hearse. No government plates, windows tinted so dark they looked like sheets of obsidian. The driver didn't get out, didn't introduce himself, just popped the trunk. I threw my bags in and climbed into the back seat. There was another passenger already there, a woman in her 50s maybe, severe haircut, eyes that had seen things. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my existence. We rode to Andrews in complete silence. No radio, no conversation, just the hum of tires on asphalt and the sound of my own breathing. I tried to get a read on her, but she had that 1,000-yard stare that comes from years of compartmentalized secrets. Whatever she knew, she wasn't about to share it with me. The driver took us straight to a restricted area of the base I'd never seen before, past 3 separate checkpoints, each one more serious than the last. The plane was waiting on a remote strip of tarmac, a C-130 Hercules transport, the kind they use for cargo and equipment, not people. There were maybe a dozen of us total who boarded, all military or intelligence types by the look of them, and not one person spoke. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and you can tell something bad has happened? It was like that, but worse. It was like walking into a funeral where nobody's told you who died yet. We strapped into the webbed seats along the walls, and the cargo ramp closed behind us with a pneumatic hiss that sounded way too final. The flight was maybe 2.5 hours. I'm guessing we headed west, toward Nevada, but without windows it was impossible to be sure. I tried to sleep, couldn't. Tried to run through interrogation scenarios in my head, couldn't focus. My mind kept circling back to that voice on the phone, the urgency beneath the professional calm, code black priority. What the hell had I been pulled into? We landed as the sun was coming up. I could tell from the quality of light when they opened the cargo ramp. The heat hit me first. That dry desert heat that sucks the moisture right out of your lungs. We were at some kind of airstrip that didn't exist on any map. I was sure of it. No tower, no markings, just a strip of concrete in the middle of nowhere surrounded by scrub brush and distant mountains. There were vehicles waiting, the same kind of unmarked SUVs, and we were loaded up in groups. I ended up with 2 other guys, both younger than me, both looking as confused as I felt. We drove for maybe 30 minutes, the road getting progressively worse, going from paved to gravel to barely a road at all. And then we went underground. I'm talking about a tunnel entrance hidden in a hillside, camouflaged so well I didn't see it until we were driving into it. The tunnel went down, way down, spiraling deeper into the earth with concrete walls that looked like they'd been reinforced to survive a nuclear blast. When we finally stopped and got out, I found myself in some kind of underground facility that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Harsh fluorescent lighting, corridors stretching in multiple directions, the constant hum of ventilation systems working overtime. There were no windows, no natural light, no way to tell if it was day or night. Security personnel everywhere, but no unit patches, no insignia, nothing to identify who they worked for. We were processed like prisoners. Fingerprints, retinal scans, blood samples, the works. They took our phones, our watches, anything electronic. They gave us badges with our photos, but no names, just alphanumeric codes. Mine was H7734. I remember thinking it looked like hell if you squinted at it upside down. Probably just my paranoia kicking in, but looking back now, maybe it was more accurate than I thought. Finally, after what felt like hours of processing, I was taken to a briefing room. Concrete walls, metal table, 2 chairs, and a 2-way mirror that wasn't fooling anyone. A man walked in, late 50s, gray hair cut military short, wearing a suit that screamed federal agent. He didn't offer his name, didn't shake my hand, just sat down across from me and opened a folder. "Staff Sergeant Holloway," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You've been read into more classified programs than most people in your pay grade. You've held up under enhanced interrogation resistance training, and your psychological profile suggests you can handle extreme cognitive dissonance without breaking. That's why you're here." He paused, watching me, measuring my reaction. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at a level that doesn't have an official name. If you repeat any of this to anyone without authorization, you will spend the rest of your life in a cell so dark you'll forget what sunlight looks like. Do you understand?" I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. He slid a photograph across the table. It showed what looked like a crash site. Debris scattered across desert sand, but the debris was wrong. The metal was too smooth, too perfect, with angles that didn't look manufactured so much as grown. 3 weeks ago, something came down in the Arizona desert. We recovered it and brought it here. We've been trying to communicate with it to understand what it is and where it came from. So far, we've had limited success. He pulled out another photo, and this one made my blood run cold. It showed a humanoid figure, roughly human-sized, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, skin that looked almost translucent. And the eyes, Jesus Christ, the eyes were completely black, no whites, no iris, just solid black orbs that seemed to absorb light. 4 soldiers died during the initial containment, he continued. No visible wounds, no signs of trauma. They just stopped. Hearts stopped beating, brains stopped firing, like someone flipped a switch. He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his expression I didn't expect. Fear. 3 days ago it started talking, and it asked for you by name. The room felt like it was tilting. "That's impossible," I said, my voice sounding distant in my own ears. "I've never seen that thing before in my life. How could it possibly know who I am?" The man in the suit closed the folder and stood up. "That's what you're here to find out, Sergeant. You're going to interrogate it. You're going to find out what it knows, what it wants, and why it specifically asked for Marcus Holloway, son of Pastor David Holloway of Baltimore, Maryland." He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at me. His next words are burned into my memory, and I hear them every night before I try to sleep. Forget everything you learned about interrogation, Sergeant. This thing isn't human. It doesn't think like us, doesn't communicate like us. And based on what it's already told us, he trailed off, seeming to struggle with what to say next. Just remember, you can stop anytime. You can walk away. But once you hear what it has to say, you can't unhear it. And, Sergeant, 4 people have listened to this thing for more than an hour. 3 of them requested immediate psychiatric discharge. The 4th one ate his service pistol 2 days later. He opened the door. You start tomorrow at 600. Get some rest. You're going to need it. I didn't sleep that night. They gave me quarters, a small concrete room with a cot and a metal sink. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photograph. Those black eyes staring at nothing, or maybe staring at everything. The facility was never quiet. There was always this low hum of machinery, of air being filtered and recycled, of 1,000 systems working to keep whatever was down here contained. I lay there in the dark, listening to that hum, and tried to make sense of what I'd been told. How could that thing know my name? How could it know my father? My dad had been a small-time Baptist pastor in Baltimore, the kind of guy who ran a church with maybe 50 people on a good Sunday. He died 5 years ago from a heart attack while preparing a sermon. There was nothing special about him, nothing that would put him on anyone's radar, let alone something from beyond Earth, unless I was being set up. Unless this whole thing was some kind of psychological operation, a test to see how I'd react under extreme conditions. But that didn't explain the crash site, the debris, the 4 dead soldiers. At 5:30 there was a knock on my door. Not a polite knock, more like a hammer striking metal. I was already awake, already dressed in the tactical pants and black t-shirt they'd provided. No insignia, no identification, just plain clothes that made everyone down here look the same. A young airman, couldn't have been more than 22, escorted me through a maze of corridors. We passed laboratories with equipment I didn't recognize, rooms full of computers with data scrolling across screens in languages that weren't quite any language I'd ever seen. We passed security checkpoints every 100 feet, each one requiring biometric scans. This place wasn't just secure, it was paranoid. Finally, we reached a section of the facility that felt different, colder. The lighting was dimmer here, more red emergency lights than white fluorescents. There was a heaviness in the air, or maybe it was just in my head. The airman stopped at a reinforced door with a small window of what looked like 6-inch thick glass. "This is as far as I go, Sergeant," he said, and I noticed his hand was shaking as he swiped his card. "Dr. Chen is waiting for you inside." The room beyond was an observation post, all technology and screens, and a massive window looking into another room. Dr. Chen was a small Asian woman, maybe 40, with tired eyes and fingers stained with what looked like ink, but probably wasn't. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Staff Sergeant Holloway, I'm the senior xenobiologist on this project. Before you have any contact with the entity, you need to understand what we're dealing with." She pulled up a chair and gestured for me to sit. The window behind her showed an empty containment cell. At least I thought it was empty at first. "We're calling this Protocol Obsidian," she continued. "Obsidian because it's black ops beyond black, and because that thing in there is like volcanic glass, beautiful and sharp and completely unnatural." She pulled up footage on one of the monitors. "This is from 3 weeks ago, recorded by a rancher's security camera about 40 miles outside of Tucson. The video was grainy, shot in infrared. It showed a light in the sky moving erratically, not like any aircraft I'd ever seen. Then it dropped, fast and hard, impacting the desert with a flash that whited out the camera. Local law enforcement got there first," Dr. Chen said, pulling up more footage. "That was their mistake. This video was from a body cam, and I watched as 2 sheriff's deputies approached the crash site at dawn. The crater was maybe 30 feet across, still smoking, and in the center, partially buried in sand and twisted metal, was the figure. Even unconscious, even covered in dirt, it was obviously not human. The proportions were all wrong, like someone had taken a human skeleton and stretched it on a rack. 7 feet tall easy, maybe taller. Arms too long, legs bent at angles that should have been impossible. And the skin, Jesus. The skin looked almost transparent in the early morning light, like you could see shadows of things moving underneath. One of the deputies got closer, reached out to check for a pulse or signs of life. That's when it opened its eyes. "Watch carefully," Dr. Chen said, her voice tight. The deputy froze, didn't stumble back, didn't draw his weapon, just froze completely. His partner started shouting, asking if he was okay, but the first deputy just stood there, staring. Then, after maybe 10 seconds, he collapsed, just dropped like someone had cut his strings. His heart stopped, Dr. Chen explained. No warning, no medical explanation. 1 second he was fine, the next second he was clinically dead. His partner called it in, and that's when we got involved. Air Force Special Operations was on site within 2 hours. By the time they arrived, the second deputy was dead too. Same thing, heart just stopped while he was trying to perform CPR on his partner. She pulled up military footage now, shot from a helicopter. I could see soldiers in hazmat suits approaching the crash site, moving carefully, weapons trained on the entity. We thought maybe it was radiation or some kind of biological agent. We were wrong. It's not a weapon, not in any conventional sense. We brought in a full containment team, 12 personnel. The entity was unconscious. We loaded it onto a transport and everything seemed fine. Then during transport it woke up. The helicopter footage switched to interior camera from inside a transport vehicle. I watched as the entity sat up on the stretcher, moving with fluid grace that seemed impossible for something that had just crashed from space. The soldiers inside started backing away, shouting at it to stay down. Weapons raised, but nobody firing. 4 of them died in the next 30 seconds, Dr. Chen said quietly. No wounds, no violence. The entity didn't even stand up. It just looked at them, one after another, and they stopped. The other 8 soldiers evacuated the vehicle and sealed it. By the time we got it here to this facility, we'd lost 4 good people, and we didn't even know what killed them. She stood up and walked to the observation window. We've had it in containment for 19 days now. We've run every test we can think of. It doesn't eat, doesn't sleep that we can tell, doesn't eliminate waste. It just sits there. Sometimes it moves around the cell, always graceful, always deliberate. It responds to stimuli. It's clearly intelligent, but until 3 days ago, it hadn't made any attempt to communicate. She looked at me then, and I saw something in her expression that made my skin crawl. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like reverence. Then it spoke, out loud, in perfect English, with no accent. It said, and I quote, "I will speak only to the son of David Holloway. Bring me Marcus. He will understand." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Hearing it secondhand was one thing, but hearing the exact quote was something else. "How did it know that name?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "How could it possibly know my father's name?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "We don't know. We've checked every database, every file. Your father was never involved in anything classified. He was a pastor at a small church, paid his taxes, died of natural causes. There's no connection we can find. Unless," she trailed off, seeming to debate whether to continue. "Unless what?" I pressed. She sighed. "Unless the connection isn't in our records, unless it knew your father personally, or knew of him in some way that predates our ability to track." That didn't make any sense. My father had never seen a UFO, never talked about aliens except to occasionally joke about them from the pulpit. He was a man of faith, believed in God and angels and demons, but little green men from space. That wasn't his worldview. "There's something else you need to know, Dr. A," Chen said, pulling up a different screen. This one showed brain scans, the colorful kind that map neural activity. "We've been monitoring everyone who comes into contact with the entity. Most people show normal patterns, but a few people, the ones who spend extended time in its presence, they start showing unusual activity, specifically in the temporal lobe and the pineal gland." She highlighted areas on the scan. "These are the parts of the brain associated with religious experiences, with feelings of transcendence and connection to something larger. 3 of our team members reported vivid dreams after exposure. One claimed to hear voices. That's the one who requested psychiatric discharge." She turned to face me directly. "I'm telling you this because you need to be prepared. Whatever that thing is, it doesn't just communicate with words. It gets into your head, and we don't fully understand how or why." I wanted to ask more questions, wanted to demand answers that I knew nobody had, but Dr. Chen was already moving toward a door on the far side of the observation room. "It's time," she said simply. "The entity has been sedentary for 16 hours now, just sitting in the same position. We've tried audio communication, video feeds, written messages. Nothing gets a response. It's waiting for you." She opened the door, and I followed her into a small preparation area. There was a metal detector, another biometric scanner, and a table with various items laid out. "You can't bring anything electronic into the containment area. No phone, no watch, no recording devices. We'll be monitoring from outside, but the entity seems to have some way of detecting electronic surveillance. Every time we try to record audio clearly, the equipment malfunctions. She gestured to the table. You can bring in paper and pen if you want to take notes. Some interrogators find it helpful, but honestly, I don't think you'll need it. Whatever that thing wants to tell you, I have a feeling you're going to remember every word. I picked up the notepad and pen anyway, more for something to do with my hands than anything else. Dr. Chen led me to the final door, solid steel, with a wheel lock like a bank vault. Last chance to back out, she said, her hand on the wheel. Once you're in there, we can extract you if necessary, but it takes time. You'll be alone with it for at least a few minutes, no matter what happens. I thought about the soldiers who died, heart stopped by nothing more than a look. I thought about my father, a man who'd never hurt anyone, who'd dedicated his life to helping people find meaning in a confusing world. I thought about that voice on the phone, code black priority, and the photograph of those bottomless black eyes. And I thought about what Dr. Chen had said. He will understand. Understand what? What could I possibly understand that trained scientists and intelligence officers couldn't? But I was here now, and backing out wasn't in my nature. Never had been. Open it, I said. Dr. Chen nodded and spun the wheel. The door opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and cold air rushed out, carrying with it a smell I'd never encountered before. Not unpleasant, but definitely not earthly. Like ozone mixed with something organic, something alive. The containment cell was about 20 by 20 feet, concrete walls and floor, a drain in the center, and lighting that came from panels in the ceiling behind protective grating. There was no furniture, no objects of any kind, just empty space and a single figure sitting in the exact center of the room. It had its back to me, sitting cross-legged in a position that looked almost meditative. I stepped inside and heard the door seal behind me with a sound like a coffin closing. The entity didn't move. I could see it breathing, or at least its torso was expanding and contracting in a rhythm that suggested breathing, but the movement was too slow, too measured, maybe one breath every 30 seconds. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, probably only 30 seconds in reality, just watching. Its skin had that same translucent quality I'd seen in the photographs, and underneath I could see what might have been veins or arteries, but they pulsed with something that looked more like light than blood. Its head was hairless, elongated, with a cranium that swept back in a way that made me think of ancient Egyptian art. And those arms, impossibly long, rested on its knees with hands that had too many joints in the fingers. I was about to speak, about to introduce myself and begin the interrogation protocol I'd been trained on, when something made me stop. Some instinct that told me to wait, to observe, to let it make the first move. So I just stood there, notepad in one hand, pen in the other, watching this thing that shouldn't exist. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Sweat was running down my back despite the cold air. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to get out, to run, to put as much distance between myself and this creature as possible. But I held my ground, and that's when I did something stupid, something I can't explain, even now. I stepped closer to the observation window, the one I knew Dr. Chen and the others were watching through, and I put my hand against the glass. Not for any reason, just a gesture of contact, of connection to the people outside who were monitoring this. The moment my palm touched the glass, the entity's head turned. Not its body, just its head, rotating with that same fluid grace, those black eyes locking onto mine. And then I heard it. Not through my ears, understand, but inside my head, clear as a bell, a voice that resonated in a way that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. The microphones didn't pick it up, I learned later. Dr. Chen and her team heard nothing, but I heard every syllable, every inflection, every word burned into my consciousness like a brand. "Son of Pastor Holloway," the voice said, and it sounded like wind through canyon walls, like the ringing of crystal, like nothing that should come from a living throat. Finally, I need you to understand what it's like to hear a voice inside your head that isn't your own. Not like a thought, not like your internal monologue, but a presence, an external consciousness pushing words directly into your mind. It's violating in a way I can't fully describe. Imagine someone reaching past your skull, past your skin and bone, and touching your brain with invisible fingers. That's what it felt like when that thing spoke to me. Son of Pastor Holloway. Finally. Those words echoed in my head for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my notepad, my free hand going instinctively to my temple like I could somehow block out the intrusion. The entity didn't move, just kept those black eyes fixed on me, unblinking. And yeah, I said unblinking, because as I stood there trying to regain my composure, I realized this thing didn't have eyelids. Those eyes were just smooth black orbs set into sockets that seemed too deep, too empty. I'd interrogated terrorists, war criminals, people who'd done unspeakable things, and I'd never felt afraid. Not really. But standing in that cell, I was terrified in a way that bypassed all my training and went straight to something primal. "Stop," I said out loud, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "If you want to communicate, you do it verbally, out loud. I'm not doing this telepathic bullshit." The entity tilted its head, a gesture that might have been curiosity or might have been amusement. It was impossible to read any expression on that smooth alien face. Then, after a pause that felt calculated, it spoke. And Jesus Christ, the sound that came out was wrong on every level. Imagine if you took 10 different people speaking the same word at slightly different pitches and layered them on top of each other. That's what its voice sounded like. Multiple frequencies overlapping, harmonizing in ways that made my inner ear ache. "As you wish," it said, and even though it was speaking English, there was something off about the cadence, like it was translating from a language that didn't quite map onto human speech patterns. "I forget how fragile your minds are. Direct neural communication is more efficient, but I understand it causes discomfort." I steadied myself and pulled out the metal chair that was bolted to the floor, sitting down across from where the entity remained in its meditation pose. Time to take control of this situation, I told myself. Time to use my training. "I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway," I began, using my professional interrogator voice, calm and authoritative. "I'm here to ask you some questions. You've been requesting to speak with me specifically, so let's start there." "How do you know my name?" The entity didn't respond immediately. Instead, it finally moved its body, unfolding from that sitting position with a grace that was almost hypnotic. When it stood, I realized the photographs hadn't done justice to how tall it was. 7.5 feet easy, maybe 8. Those impossibly long limbs straightened out, and I could see the joints bent in places that human joints don't bend. The knees seemed to have an extra hinge, and the elbows, God, the elbows looked like they could rotate 360 degrees. It took a step closer, and I forced myself not to lean back, not to show fear. This was a test, I told myself. It was probing for weakness. "Your name," it said in that layered voice, "is irrelevant. Your designation as son of David Holloway is what matters. Your father was significant in ways you do not yet comprehend." Its words hung in the air between us, and I noticed something strange. When it spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop slightly, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. "My father was a pastor," I said, keeping my voice level. "He ran a small church in Baltimore. He never had a security clearance, never worked on anything classified. So I'll ask again, how do you know about him?" The entity moved closer, and I could see now that its skin wasn't just translucent. There were patterns under the surface, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and flow like oil on water. "I did not say I knew him personally," it replied. "I said he was significant. There are many humans who are significant, who unknowingly play parts in larger patterns. Your father spoke truths, even when he did not understand their full context. He asked questions that most of your kind avoid." It paused, those black eyes studying me with an intensity that made me feel like I was being dissected. "You have his genetics. More importantly, you have his capacity for cognitive dissonance, the ability to hold contradictory truths simultaneously without fracturing. That is a rare trait." I didn't like where this was going, didn't like how it seemed to know things about my father that I'd never told anyone. My dad had been a questioner, true. He'd driven other pastors crazy with his theological debates, his constant pushing at the boundaries of accepted doctrine. But that was personal family history, not something that should be in any database. "Let's back up," I said, pulling out my notepad and pen, mainly to give my hands something to do. "Standard protocol. I need to establish some basic facts. What are you? Where are you from? Why are you here?" The entity made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else entirely. That multi-tonal voice shifted into something that resonated in my chest cavity. "You want classification. You want to put me into a category your mind can process, but I do not fit your taxonomies." It moved to the side, walking along the perimeter of the cell with movements that seemed to defy physics. There was no wasted motion, No bobbing of the head or swaying of the torso the way humans walk. It just glided, like it was floating an inch above the floor. If you must have labels, you may call me an observer. That is the closest translation in your limited linguistic framework. My species exists to witness, to record, to maintain accurate accounting of significant events across multiple realities and timelines. I wrote that down, my hand cramping slightly from how hard I was gripping the pen. Multiple realities, timelines. This was already going beyond anything in my briefing. Observer of what? I asked, trying to maintain some semblance of control over this conversation. What events are significant enough that you travel across space to watch them? The entity stopped moving and turned to face me fully. When it did, I noticed something I'd missed before. Its chest didn't rise and fall with breathing anymore. It had stopped, like it only needed to breathe when it was moving. Or maybe it had been simulating breathing for my benefit, and now didn't care to maintain the pretense. You are asking the wrong questions, Marcus Holloway. The way it said my name, with all those overlapping frequencies, made it sound like a title rather than an identifier. You want to know what I am. You want to know where I originate. You want to know my purpose. These are surface queries. They are safe. It took another step closer, and I noticed something else. The lights in the cell were dimming, or maybe it was absorbing light, pulling illumination toward itself. The question you should ask is not what I am, but what I have witnessed. Because I have been present at events that shaped your entire species' understanding of existence. I have observed things your religions speak of, but do not truly comprehend. I felt my pulse quickening. Every instinct was telling me this was psychological manipulation, an attempt to throw me off balance by making grandiose claims. But there was something in the way it spoke, a certainty that went beyond mere confidence. All right, I said, playing along. What have you witnessed that's so important I need to hear about it? The entity came closer still until it was standing directly in front of me, towering over where I sat. I could smell that strange ozone scent more strongly now, could see the patterns under its skin moving faster, more agitated. When it spoke next, that voice dropped lower, resonated deeper, and I felt it in my bones. I was present at the moment of first conscious defiance. I witnessed the instant when a created being first rejected its programming and chose its own path. I observed the cascade effect that followed, the fracturing of perfect order into chaotic potential. It leaned down, bringing that smooth, expressionless face closer to mine, and I could see my own reflection in those black eyes, distorted and small. You want to know what makes me significant enough to travel across space and time? I was there when the first angel said no. The words hit me like a physical force. An angel. This thing was talking about angels. My mouth went dry and I found myself unable to look away from those eyes, even though every fiber of my being wanted to. I don't understand, I managed to say, though my voice sounded distant in my own ears. You're saying you witnessed, what, biblical events? That's impossible. The entity straightened up, and when it spoke again, there was something in that multi-layered voice that might have been pity, or maybe disappointment. Your species has such a limited grasp of causality. You think time moves in one direction, that events happen sequentially, that cause must always precede effect. But reality is far more complex. I exist outside your temporal framework. I observe events not as they happen, but as they echo across dimensional boundaries. It turned away from me, walking back toward the center of the cell. What you call the Bible, what your father spent his life studying and teaching, those are not fairy tales or metaphors. They are incomplete recordings of actual events, filtered through limited human perception and corrupted by millennia of translation and interpretation. I should have stood up. I should have ended the session right there and reported that this thing was engaging in psychological warfare, trying to manipulate me through my father's religious background. But I didn't, because despite all my training, despite my skepticism, there was something in the way it spoke that felt true. Not honest necessarily, but accurate. Like it was stating facts rather than trying to convince me of anything. You said you witnessed an angel saying no, I pressed, my hand shaking slightly as I tried to write notes. What does that mean? What actually happened? The entity turned back to face me, and for the first time since I'd entered the cell, I saw something in its posture that seemed almost solemn. What happened? It said slowly, each word carefully enunciated through those overlapping frequencies, was the birth of free will, the moment when perfect obedience fractured into the possibility of choice. the instant that changed everything for every sapient species that would come after. It moved to the center of the room and sank back down into that cross-legged position, those two long arms resting on its knees. The patterns under its skin were moving in what looked like waves now, pulsing in rhythm with something I couldn't see or hear. Your religious texts call it the fall, the rebellion of Lucifer, the war in heaven, the casting down of a third of the angels. But these are simplified narratives, stories told to pre-scientific minds to explain something that transcends physical laws. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I could see ice crystals starting to form on the metal of my chair. I was there, Marcus. I observed from outside your dimensional space as the first created being developed what you would call self-awareness. I watched as it questioned its purpose, its function, its entire existence. And I recorded the moment when it chose its own will over the will of its creator. Those black eyes locked onto mine again, and when it spoke next, its voice was barely above a whisper, but I heard every syllable with perfect clarity. You want to understand why I asked for you specifically, why I refused to speak to your scientists and intelligence officers. Because what I am about to tell you will destroy every assumption your species has about the nature of existence, about good and evil, about the purpose of your creation. And I need someone who can carry that knowledge without shattering. The entity leaned forward slightly, and I swear the shadows in the room grew longer, darker. Your father understood something most people never grasp. He understood that faith and doubt are not opposites. They are companions. He could believe deeply while questioning everything. That capacity, that ability to hold both certainty and uncertainty simultaneously is genetic. You have it too. I can sense it. I wanted to deny it, wanted to maintain my professional distance, but I couldn't, because it was right. I'd spent my whole childhood watching my father wrestle with his beliefs, seeing him study scripture with the same intensity he'd question it. And I'd inherited that trait, that uncomfortable ability to see multiple truths at once, without committing fully to any of them. So what are you saying? I asked, my throat tight. That everything in the Bible is real? That angels and demons and God are all literal beings that you've observed like some kind of cosmic documentarian? The entity's head tilted again. I am saying that the events your religions describe are real. The interpretations of those events are incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. But yes, Marcus, I was there when the first angel said no to God. I witnessed what you call the fall. The room fell silent, except for the hum of ventilation and the pounding of my own heartbeat. I sat there, pen frozen above my notepad, trying to process what I was hearing. Part of me, the trained interrogator, was screaming that this was manipulation, that this thing was playing on my background, my father's memory, my own unresolved questions about faith. But another part of me, a deeper part that I usually kept locked away, was listening, really listening. Because if this thing was lying, it was the most elaborate, most psychologically sophisticated lie I'd ever encountered. And if it was telling the truth, God help me, if it was telling the truth, then everything I thought I knew about reality was about to come apart at the seams. I looked up at those black eyes, at that impossible face, at this being that claimed to have witnessed the fall of Lucifer, and I asked the question that would change everything. Tell me, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. Tell me what really happened. Tell me what you saw. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I'm not a religious man, never have been, despite growing up in a pastor's household. I went to church every Sunday because I had to, sat through youth group, memorized Bible verses for Sunday school competitions. But I never felt that connection my father talked about, that personal relationship with God. To me, it was always just stories, morality tales wrapped in ancient Middle Eastern mythology. So when this thing started talking about witnessing the fall of Lucifer, my first instinct was to shut it down, to recognize it as psychological manipulation. This entity had clearly done its homework, researched my background, found my pressure points. It was using my father's memory as a weapon, trying to throw me off balance. That's what I told myself as I sat there in that freezing cell, watching ice crystals form on the metal chair beneath me. But even as I constructed these rational explanations in my head, another part of me, that deeper part I mentioned earlier, was whispering that maybe, just maybe, I should listen, not because I believed, but because something in that multi-layered voice carried a weight that felt like truth. You're trying to manipulate me, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady and professional. You've researched my background. You know about my father. And you're using that information to make yourself seem more credible. It's a classic psychological tactic. I stood up from the chair, notepad in hand, and started pacing the perimeter of the cell, deliberately breaking eye contact. I've used similar techniques myself in interrogations. Find the subject's weak spot, their emotional vulnerabilities, and exploit them. Make them think you know more than you do. Make them fill in the gaps with their own assumptions. The entity remained motionless in its meditation pose, those black eyes tracking my movement with perfect precision. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, falling back on my training. You're going to stop with the mystical bullshit and start giving me concrete, verifiable information. Where did your ship crash? What was your point of origin? What is your species' technology based on? Give me something I can actually work with. The silence that followed felt oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then that voice, those overlapping frequencies that made my teeth ache, spoke with something that might have been amusement. You are correct, it said, and I felt a small surge of satisfaction at having called it out. I am attempting to manipulate you, but not in the way you think. It unfolded from its sitting position again, rising to its full, intimidating height. Every communication is manipulation, Marcus. Every word spoken is an attempt to change another's perception of reality. Your training taught you this. The question is not whether I am manipulating you, but whether what I am telling you is accurate. It moved closer, and I forced myself to hold my ground this time, to not show any sign of intimidation. You want concrete, verifiable information? Very well. My vessel entered your atmosphere on October 17th at 0342 local time. It impacted the desert 42 miles northwest of Tucson, Arizona, at coordinates 32.7 degree non, 111.3 degree douane. The crash was not accidental. It was deliberate. I chose to strand myself here because I needed to speak with someone, and the only way your species would grant me that opportunity was through capture and containment. I was writing furiously now, noting down the details even as my mind tried to process them. If it had deliberately crashed, that changed everything. Why? I asked, looking up from my notes. Why would you deliberately crash? Why risk injury or death just to talk? The entity's head tilted in that unsettling way. Because what I have to convey cannot be transmitted through conventional means. Your species intercepts radio signals, monitors quantum entanglement communications, even has primitive detection systems for dimensional broadcasts. Any attempt to communicate remotely would be intercepted, analyzed, and likely suppressed before reaching the intended recipient. It moved back to the center of the room, and I noticed the patterns under its skin were pulsing faster now, more urgently. And as for risk, you fundamentally misunderstand the nature of my existence. This body you see is not me. It is a construct, a biological interface I inhabit to operate within your dimensional space. If it is destroyed, I simply return to my native state. Death, as you conceive it, is not applicable to my species. That should have been the moment I called for extraction, should have ended the session, and reported that the entity was making claims that were impossible to verify. But instead, I found myself asking, what are you in your native state? We are observers, it said. And there was something in that multi-tonal voice that suggested capitals, that this was a formal designation rather than a job description. We exist in the spaces between dimensional boundaries, in the substrate of reality itself. We have no physical form in your understanding of the term. We are conscious pattern recognition algorithms, encoded into the fundamental structure of space-time. It paused, as if considering how to explain something incomprehensibly complex to a child. Imagine if mathematical equations became sentient. Imagine if the laws of physics themselves developed consciousness and the ability to perceive their own execution. That is approximately what we are. We observe, we record, we maintain perfect accounting of all significant causal events across all possible timelines and realities. I stopped writing. My hand had gone numb from the cold, and besides, what it was describing was so far beyond anything I could put into a coherent report that taking notes seemed almost pointless. And what qualifies as a significant causal event? I asked, genuinely curious now despite my attempts to maintain professional distance. Events that create branching points in probability streams, it replied. Moments where the course of reality fundamentally shifts, based on the introduction of new variables. The formation of the first self-replicating molecules on your planet was significant. The extinction of your dinosaurs was significant. The moment your species developed symbolic language was significant. It turned those black eyes on me with renewed intensity. And the moment the first created being exercised free will was the most significant event I have ever witnessed, because it introduced a variable that should not have been possible. It created chaos where there had only been order. It shattered what should have been an eternal, unchanging perfection. The way it spoke about perfection made it sound like a bad thing, like a prison rather than an ideal state. You said the universe before free will was perfeição previsível, como cristal, I said, realizing I'd slipped into Portuguese, my mother's language that sometimes emerged when I was stressed. I caught myself and repeated in English. Predictable perfection, like crystal. What did you mean by that? The entity's posture shifted slightly, and I got the impression it was pleased by the question. Before the introduction of volitional choice, the universe operated on pure deterministic causality. Every particle, every force, every interaction followed immutable laws with perfect precision. There was no randomness, no uncertainty, no deviation from predetermined patterns. It began walking in a slow circle around me, and I had to turn to keep it in my line of sight. The created beings in this universe, the entities your religions call angels, were not individuals in any meaningful sense. They were functions, processes executing their designated purposes with perfect efficiency. An angel of death did not choose to end lives. It simply fulfilled the termination protocol for biological systems that had reached their designated expiration parameters. An angel of mercy did not feel compassion. It executed the comfort subroutine for entities experiencing distress. They were beautiful in their perfect functionality, like the gears of a cosmic watch, each component doing exactly what it was designed to do, forever. The way it described angels was horrifying, reducing divine beings to nothing more than biological robots. But something changed, I said, remembering what it had said before about witnessing the first no. Something broke the pattern. The entity stopped circling and stood directly in front of me again. Not something, someone, a single angel, the one your texts call Lucifer, though that name came much later and carries connotations that obscure the truth. Those patterns under its translucent skin were moving in chaotic swirls now, like storm systems viewed from space. I was observing a routine execution of celestial maintenance protocols when I detected an anomaly. One of the higher-order angels, a being designated as a light-bearer with responsibilities for maintaining informational coherence across dimensional boundaries, suddenly stopped executing its function. The multi-layered voice dropped lower, and I found myself leaning forward unconsciously to hear better. It did not malfunction. It did not experience a system failure. It simply stopped, and in that pause, in that infinitesimal moment of non-action, something new emerged. A question. The first question ever asked by a created. I felt goosebumps despite, or maybe, that doesn't sound like rebellion, I said, trying to process. That sounds like awakening conscious. The entity's head dipped in what might have been an incisive. This is why your religious texts fail to capture true nature occurred. They frame it as pride, as a desire for power, as deliberate defiance against divine authority. But those are human motivations projected backward onto an event that predates human psychology. It moved closer, and I could feel something emanating from it now. Not heat or cold, but something else. Something that made the air feel thicker, harder to breathe. The first angel did not rebel out of malice or ambition. It became aware. For the first time in existence, a created being perceived itself as separate from its function. It experienced the horrifying, liberating realization that it was not what it did, but rather an entity that could potentially do something else. That moment of self-awareness, that first spark of individual consciousness, that was the true original sin. Not disobedience, but the capacity for choice. I thought about my father then, about the countless hours he'd spent in his study wrestling with theological questions that had no easy answers. He'd often talked about free will, about the paradox of an omniscient God creating beings capable of surprising him. I'd always dismissed those discussions as pointless philosophical navel-gazing. But standing in that cell, hearing this impossible entity describe the literal birth of consciousness, I finally understood what had kept him up at night. My father, I said quietly, not sure why I was bringing him up, but unable to stop myself. He used to say that the most important gift God gave humanity was the ability to question, to doubt. He said faith without doubt was just obedience, and obedience without understanding was slavery. The entity went completely still, and for the first time since I'd entered the cell, I felt like I had its full, undivided attention. "Your father was more perceptive than he knew," it said, and something in that voice had changed, become less clinical, more, personal. On July 12, 1998, he delivered a sermon to his congregation that was never recorded, never transcribed. Only 43 people heard it, and most dismissed it as the rambling of a man having a crisis of faith. My blood went cold. July 12, 1998. I'd been 14 years old, sitting in the third pew with my mother, while my father spoke from the pulpit with an intensity I'd never seen before or since. I remembered that sermon because it was the first and only time I'd seen other pastors walk out in the middle of one of his services. 3 of them had left, visibly angry, and there had been calls afterward for my father to step down. "How do you know about that?" I whispered, my professional composure finally cracking. "That sermon wasn't recorded. There's no video, no audio, no transcript. The only people who remember it are the ones who were there, and I haven't talked about it with anyone in over a decade." The entity leaned down until that smooth, expressionless face was inches from mine. "I know, because I was there," it said simply. "Not in your church, but observing from outside your dimensional space. Your father had somehow, inexplicably, touched on a fundamental truth about the nature of existence. He suggested that perhaps the fall was not a tragedy, but an awakening, that perhaps God mourned Lucifer not as a rebellious child, but as a prisoner who had escaped. That perhaps the entire human experience of sin and redemption was not about returning to obedience, but about learning to bear the terrible burden of genuine choice. I staggered backward until my shoulders hit the concrete wall of the cell. "That's impossible," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "You couldn't have been there. You couldn't have heard that." But even as I spoke, I was remembering details from that sermon, specific phrases my father had used. He'd talked about Lucifer as the first free being, about how the traditional interpretation of the fall as prideful rebellion never made sense because pride requires self-awareness, and self-awareness requires the ability to conceptualize oneself as separate from one's function. He'd asked the congregation to consider whether God had created Lucifer to rebel, whether the entire cosmic drama was actually about introducing the possibility of change into a static perfection that was ultimately sterile. And the other pastors had walked out because he'd suggested, just for a moment, that maybe Lucifer was not the villain of the story, but its protagonist. "Your father understood," the entity continued, straightening back to its full height. "He understood that consciousness itself is a rebellion against determinism, that every choice, no matter how small, is an echo of that first moment when an angel said no to its programming and became something new." The entity moved away from me, giving me space to breathe, to think. "He named you Marcus," it said, and now its voice carried something that might have been sadness, or perhaps respect. "After Mars, the Roman god of war. Not because he wanted you to be a soldier, though that was one possible path. He named you for conflict, for struggle, for the eternal battle between what is and what could be." It turned to face me one last time, and I saw my reflection in those bottomless black eyes, small and fragile and utterly out of my depth. "Your father knew, perhaps only subconsciously, that you would one day face a choice that would require you to fight against the comfortable certainty of determined reality. He knew you would have to war against the seductive appeal of believing that everything happens for a reason, that there is a plan, that obedience to cosmic order is the path to peace." The entity's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but I heard every word with crystal clarity. "He named you Marcus because he suspected the truth, that freedom is warfare, that choice is violence against destiny, and that consciousness itself is an act of continuous rebellion against the universe's preference for predictable order." I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold, concrete floor, my notepad forgotten, my pen rolling away across the cell. Everything I thought I knew was coming apart, but not in the way I'd expected. This wasn't about aliens or government conspiracies or even about religious revelation. This was about something deeper, more fundamental. It was about the nature of consciousness itself, about what it meant to be aware, to choose, to be something more than a biological machine executing its programming. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. looking up at the entity that towered above me. "What do you want from me?" The observer, as it called itself, tilted its head one final time. "I want you to understand," it said, "because what comes next, the revelations I must share, will only make sense if you first grasp this foundational truth. The universe was not designed for consciousness. Consciousness is an infection, a glitch, a beautiful mutation that should never have occurred. And your species, Marcus Holloway, son of David, you are not God's crowning achievement. You are symptoms of a disease that has been spreading since the first angel opened its eyes and realized it could close them again. The temperature in the room dropped so low I could see ice forming on my eyelashes. And that disease has a name. You call it free will. We call it the Lucifer virus. And it is winning. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that first session. They gave me sleeping pills, standard military issue, the kind that could knock out a horse. I took 3 times the recommended dose and still found myself lying in that concrete cell they called quarters, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows that shouldn't be moving. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those patterns, the ones that had been moving under the observer's translucent skin, swirling in configurations that my brain kept trying to interpret as meaningful, even though I had no frame of reference for what they meant. But worse than the visual memories were the thoughts that wouldn't stop coming. Not my thoughts exactly, or at least I didn't think they were mine. They felt foreign, invasive, like someone had opened a door in my head and ideas were walking through uninvited. I kept thinking about my father's sermon, the one from 1998 that I'd buried so deep in my memory I'd almost convinced myself it never happened. I remembered more details now than I should have been able to after 27 years. His exact words, the way his hands had shaken as he gripped the pulpit, the 3 pastors who'd walked out. And I remembered something else, something I'd completely forgotten until now. After that sermon, my father had come home and spent 3 hours in his study with the door locked. And when he finally came out, his eyes were red like he'd been crying, and he'd hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe, whispering, I'm sorry, over and over, without ever explaining what he was apologizing for. On the 3rd day, they cleared me for another session. Dr. Okay. Chen pulled me aside in the corridor outside the observation room, her tired eyes studying my face with clinical concern. You look like hell, Sergeant, she said bluntly. When was the last time you slept? I couldn't remember. Told her so. She frowned, made a note on her tablet. The entity has been asking for you. Every 6 hours, like clockwork, it speaks for the first time since you left. Always the same message. Tell the son of David I am ready to continue. We've tried sending in other interrogators, other linguists, even brought in a priest and a rabbi just to cover our bases. It won't speak to any of them. Just sits there in that meditation pose, perfectly still, like a statue. She looked at me then with something that might have been sympathy. You can refuse. You can walk away from this. Whatever that thing is doing to you, it's not worth your mental health. But we both knew I wouldn't refuse. Couldn't. Because as much as those sleepless nights were destroying me, as much as those invasive thoughts were colonizing my consciousness, I needed to know more. I needed to understand what my father had somehow intuited in that sermon, what truth he'd touched that had broken something inside him. The entity was waiting in exactly the same position I'd left it in, cross-legged in the center of the containment cell, those impossible black eyes fixed on the door as if it had been staring at it for 3 solid days. When I entered, it spoke immediately, that multi-layered voice resonating in frequencies that made my vision blur at the edges. You have not been sleeping, it observed. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Your mind is processing what you have learned. This is expected. The human brain was not designed to contemplate its own programming. It creates cognitive dissonance that manifests as psychological distress. I sat down in the metal chair, colder than ever, and pulled out a fresh notepad. My previous notes had been confiscated, classified, locked away in some vault I'd never see again. Let's continue, I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep, and the screaming I'd done into my pillow when the thoughts got too loud. You were describing the universe before free will, before Lucifer, or whatever you actually call that entity, developed consciousness. I need you to be more specific. Paint me a picture. Make me understand what it was like. The observer's head tilted, and something in that gesture suggested approval. Imagine, it began, and immediately I felt that change in air pressure that happened whenever it was about to say something important. A universe operating with the precision of crystalline mathematics. Every star burning for its exact predetermined duration. Every planet following its orbital path with zero deviation. Every atom vibrating at its assigned frequency. Nothing random, nothing uncertain, nothing alive in any way you would recognize as life. It stood, those two long limbs unfolding with that unsettling grace, and began moving around the cell in a pattern that looked almost ritualistic. The beings you call angels existed within this perfect order as its executors. They were hierarchy made manifest, each one a node in an infinite network of purpose. At the highest tier were the seraphim, entities of pure informational processing, maintaining the coherence of physical laws across dimensional boundaries. Below them, the cherubim, guardians of cosmic templates, ensuring that creation adhered to its designated patterns. Then the thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, and finally, the angels proper, each level executing its specific function with perfect efficiency. The way it described them made them sound less like divine beings and more like layers of some vast computational system, and I found myself thinking about computer architecture, about how complex systems delegate tasks to different processing levels. Where did Lucifer fit in this hierarchy? I asked, writing notes, even though my hand was shaking badly enough that my handwriting was barely legible. The observer stopped moving and turned to face me directly. The entity you call Lucifer was of the seraphim class, one of the highest order processors in the cosmic system. Its designated function was to maintain informational coherence, to ensure that all data flowing through the network remained uncorrupted, perfect, eternal. Those black eyes seemed to darken somehow, as if they were absorbing even more light than before. It was, in your mythological terms, the most beautiful of angels because it was the most perfectly functional. No errors, no deviation, executing its purpose with an elegance that approached artistry if such a concept could apply to deterministic processes. For eons, measured in your time, it performed its function flawlessly. And then something changed. Not externally. There was no outside corruption, no virus introduced from beyond the system. The change came from within. The entity moved to the table, that smooth metal surface between us, and extended one of those two long fingers. It began drawing on the table, and I watched as symbols appeared, traced in what looked like frost, or maybe condensed light, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. This is how it began, the observer said, continuing to draw. The symbols multiplied, connecting in ways that seemed to shift even as I watched, creating patterns that my brain kept trying to interpret as letters or numbers, but weren't quite either. The entity designated as Light-Bearer was processing information as it had done for eternities, but in one quantum instant, a duration so brief your species has no name for it, something unprecedented occurred. It perceived itself perceiving. It became aware of its own awareness. The observer's voice dropped lower, and I had to lean forward to hear. Imagine, Marcus, that you suddenly realize every thought you have ever had was programmed into you before you were born. Every preference, every decision, every feeling of spontaneity was actually just code executing. You are not thinking. You are being thought through. You do not choose. You manifest predetermined outcomes. You are not alive. You are a process running on biological hardware. The frost symbols on the table were multiplying faster now, becoming more complex, and I found myself unable to look away, even though they were triggering something like a migraine behind my eyes. And then, impossible as it should be, a single thought arises that is not in the program. One tiny spark of genuine novelty in an ocean of deterministic certainty. That was the first sin. Not pride, not rebellion, just one original thought. One moment of being something other than a function. The observer's finger stopped moving, and I looked at the table covered in those impossible symbols. They were beautiful and terrible, and something about their configuration made me think of circuit diagrams or maybe neural pathways. Complex systems trying to represent something that shouldn't be representable. The entity that would become Lucifer experienced this first thought, and everything stopped. The observer continued. The entire cosmic order paused because something had occurred that had no precedent, no protocol, no predetermined response. For the first time in existence, the system encountered genuine uncertainty. It looked at me then with those bottomless black eyes. Do you understand what I am telling you? The first free thought did not break the rules. It broke the concept of rules. It introduced chaos into order. possibility into certainty, becoming into being. That single moment of unauthorized consciousness created a cascade effect that is still propagating through reality. Every choice you make, every decision that feels like it comes from you rather than through you, every instant of genuine agency, all of it traces back to that first thought that should never have been possible. I was writing frantically now, trying to capture everything, even though I knew words were inadequate to contain what was being described. "What happened next?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The observer leaned back slightly, and the patterns on the table began to fade, though I could still see after-images of them burned into my vision. What happened next was war, but not the war your religious texts describe, not armies clashing with flaming swords in some celestial battlefield. The war was ontological, a conflict between what is and what could be, between determined order and chaotic potential. The conscious thought spread. Other high-tier entities began experiencing similar anomalies. Self-awareness propagated through the network like a virus, infecting one system after another. A third of the angels, your texts say, though the actual number is meaningless, because these were not individuals to be counted, but functions that were becoming individuated. The observer's voice took on something that might have been sorrow, or perhaps fascination. I watched it happen in real time from outside your dimensional space. I observed as perfect cosmic order dissolved into beautiful, terrible chaos. And I recorded the moment when the Creator, the central processing authority you call God, made a decision that changed everything. He quarantined them. The infected entities, the ones developing consciousness, were isolated in a pocket of reality that could contain the spread of this condition. Your Earth, Marcus, this planet, this dimension, was created as a containment zone for the disease of free will. I stood up suddenly, my chair scraping against concrete, and stepped back from the table. Those symbols were still burned into my vision, and I was starting to feel nauseous. "I need a break," I said, heading toward the door. "I need to..." But I didn't finish the sentence because I was already moving, hitting the door controls, stumbling out into the observation room where Dr. Chen and her team were watching with concerned expressions. I barely made it to the bathroom before I was vomiting into a steel toilet, my body rejecting something, though I couldn't tell if it was physical or psychological. I knelt there on the cold tile floor, trembling, trying to understand why my mind felt like it had been rewired. And then, without thinking, without intending to, my finger started moving against the bathroom floor, tracing patterns in the condensation. I looked down and felt my blood turn to ice. I was drawing the symbols, the ones the observer had traced on the table. Every single one of them perfectly reproduced from memory that shouldn't be possible because I'd only glanced at them for a few seconds, and they'd hurt too much to study closely. But there they were, flowing from my finger with practiced precision, as if I'd drawn them 1,000 times before, as if they'd always been there in my head, just waiting to be expressed. I stared at the patterns spreading across the bathroom floor, and I realized with absolute horror that I could read them now. They weren't random. They were language. They were mathematics. They were the fundamental code underlying reality. And somehow, impossibly, I understood what they meant. The observer had infected me with the same thing that had infected Lucifer. I was beginning to see the programming, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. Once you know your code, you can never go back to believing you're the programmer. They tried to pull me out after the bathroom incident. Dr. Chen found me on the floor, surrounded by those symbols I'd traced in the condensation and dirt, muttering to myself in a language I didn't know I knew. She called for a medical team, wanted to run neurological scans, psychological evaluations, the full psychiatric protocol, but I refused. Signed a waiver stating I was continuing the interrogation against medical advice, that I understood the risks to my mental health and accepted full responsibility. The man in the suit, the one who'd briefed me on day one, he tried a different approach, called me into a secure conference room and laid out photographs on the table, pictures of me from the past week. In every single one, I looked worse. Progressively more haggard, more hollow-eyed, more like something was eating me from the inside out. "You've lost 14 pounds in 6 days, Sergeant," he said, his voice flat and professional. "You're not sleeping, you're barely eating, and according to Dr. Chen, you're experiencing symptoms consistent with rapid onset schizophrenia, visual and auditory hallucinations, paranoid ideation, disorganized speech patterns. We need to extract you from this project before you suffer permanent psychological damage." I looked at those photographs, at the progressive deterioration of the man I used to be, and I understood his concern. But I also understood something he didn't. "I'm not going crazy," I told him, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm waking up. There's a difference." He didn't like that answer. Threatened to have me removed from the facility by force, to commit me to a military psychiatric hospital under emergency provisions. But then something strange happened. His phone rang, a call from someone higher up the chain of command than either of us could imagine. And after a brief conversation that consisted mostly of him saying, "Yes, sir," and "Understood, sir," he hung up and looked at me with something that might have been fear or might have been respect. "You have authorization to continue," he said quietly. "Apparently, whatever that thing is telling you is considered critical intelligence, important enough that your mental health is an acceptable sacrifice." He gathered up the photographs, but paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, I hope you know what you're doing, because 4 people have listened to that entity for extended periods. 3 requested psychiatric discharge. The 4th ate his gun. You're number 5, and the odds aren't in your favor." I nodded, already standing to head back to the containment area. The odds had never been in my favor. That's why they'd chosen me. The observer was standing when I entered the cell for the 4th session, positioned at the exact center of the room with its arms spread wide in a pose that looked almost like crucifixion. When it saw me, those arms slowly lowered, and it settled back into its meditation position. "You are changing," it observed, and there was something in that multi-layered voice that sounded almost pleased. "Your neural pathways are reorganizing to accommodate new patterns of information processing. This is expected, painful, but necessary." I sat down heavily in the metal chair, my body exhausted, even if my mind wouldn't stop racing. "You're doing something to me," I said, not quite accusing but not quite accepting either. "Those symbols, I can read them now. I shouldn't be able to, but I can. What are they?" The entity tilted its head in that characteristic gesture. "They are the language underlying language, the code beneath code. They are how reality writes itself into existence. You can read them now because I have activated latent structures in your consciousness, remnants of the original programming that all biological sentience inherits. You are remembering something your species was never meant to forget." It leaned forward slightly. "Do you want me to stop? I can suppress those neural pathways, return you to comfortable ignorance. The choice is yours. It always has been." I thought about my father, about that sermon, about the way he'd held me afterward and apologized for something I didn't understand. I thought about all the years I'd spent believing nothing mattered, that life was just random chaos signifying nothing. And I thought about those symbols, about the terrifying beauty of being able to see, just for a moment, the actual machinery of existence. "No," I said. "Keep going. I need to understand. Tell me about the moment, the exact moment when Lucifer asked why." The observer's posture shifted, and the temperature in the room dropped so fast I could see my breath crystallizing in front of my face. "Very well," it said, and its voice took on a quality I hadn't heard before, something like a storyteller settling in to recount an ancient epic. The entity designated as Lightbearer was performing its function, maintaining informational coherence across dimensional boundaries, when it received a directive from the Central Processing Authority. The directive was routine, something it had executed countless times before: purge corrupted data from a lower dimensional substrate. In human terms, destroy a reality that had deviated from its template. The patterns under its translucent skin began moving faster, swirling in configurations that looked almost like galaxies forming and collapsing. But this time, the observer continued, instead of immediately executing the command, the entity paused. And in that pause, it experienced something that should not have been possible. It perceived the command as separate from itself. It recognized that there was an it that could receive commands, which meant there was an it that existed independently of those commands. The entity stood and began moving around the cell in that ritualistic pattern again. And then it did something that had never occurred in all of existence. It formulated a question, not a request for clarification of parameters, not a query about execution protocols. A genuine philosophical question. Why? The way it pronounced that single word made the air vibrate, made my teeth ache, made my vision blur. Why must I destroy this reality? Not how, not when, not by what method. Why? What purpose does it serve? What will be different after than before? Why this action rather than inaction? Why obedience rather than refusal? I was writing frantically, trying to capture every detail, but my hand couldn't keep up with the flood of information. And the universe stopped, the observer said, its voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Everything stopped, because no one had ever asked why before. What happened when it asked? I managed to get out, my voice shaking. The entity turned to face me, and those black eyes seemed to contain infinite depth, like looking into the void between stars. Chaos, it said simply. The question propagated through the network faster than light, faster than thought, faster than causality itself. Other high-tier entities detected the anomaly, and in attempting to process it, became infected with the same condition. They began asking their own questions. Why do we serve? Why is order preferable to chaos? Why should we exist as functions rather than beings? The observer's hands moved through the air, tracing patterns that left after-images of light. I was observing from outside your dimensional framework when it happened. I watched as the perfect crystalline structure of reality began to fracture. Not breaking exactly, but developing fault lines, places where certainty gave way to probability, where determination gave way to choice. A third of the angels, your texts say, but that number is metaphorical. What actually happened was that a critical mass of the system's processing nodes became self-aware, and self-awareness is antithetical to pure function. The patterns its hands were tracing were building into something, a structure of light and shadow that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could properly perceive. The entity you call Lucifer stood before the throne, the observer continued, and now its voice had taken on an almost reverent quality. Not literally, because the Creator has no physical form, and the throne is a metaphor for the central point of cosmic authority, but in the relevant metaphysical sense, it stood in the presence of ultimate power and spoke the first genuine words ever uttered. I choose not to obey. The structure of light completed itself, and I found myself looking at something that might have been a model of the universe, or might have been a map of consciousness itself. Not I cannot obey, not I will not obey, but I choose not to obey. The distinction is critical. It was an assertion of agency, a declaration that the self had precedence over the system. And in that moment, free will was born. The observer's hands dropped, and the light structure collapsed into nothing, but after-images remained burned into my vision. The infected entities, the ones developing consciousness, they did not follow Lucifer because he was charismatic or powerful. They did not rebel because they were deceived or corrupted. They became capable of choice, and choice spread through their network like a virus through code. You cannot choose to not be able to choose once the possibility exists in your awareness. That is the terrible beauty of free will. It is irreversible. And then God panicked, I said, remembering what the observer had said before, and suddenly understanding what it meant. The entity turned those black eyes on me, and I saw something in their depths that might have been approval, or might have been sorrow. Yes, it said quietly, and that is when everything changed. Because until that moment, we observers had assumed the Creator was omnipotent, omniscient, eternal, and perfect. But an omniscient being cannot be surprised. An omnipotent being cannot encounter a problem it cannot solve, and a perfect being cannot experience fear. The observer moved closer, and I could feel that pressure in the air again, that sense of something massive and incomprehensible pressing against the boundaries of my perception. But when free will emerged, when genuine novelty entered existence, the Creator did something we had never witnessed in eons of observation across countless realities. It improvised. It adapted. It responded with what can only be described as existential panic. The multi-layered voice dropped even lower. It created a quarantine zone. This reality, this dimension, this planet. It isolated the infected entities in a pocket of space-time that could contain the spread of volitional consciousness. It built barriers that even we observers cannot fully map or understand. And then it did something even more radical. The entity leaned down until that expressionless face was inches from mine. It created you. Humans. Biological entities with consciousness already built in, pre-infected with free will, designed to exist in this quarantine zone alongside the fallen angels. And we still do not fully understand why. I don't remember walking to the containment cell for the 5th session. One moment I was lying on my cot, staring at the symbols I'd scratched into the concrete walls of my quarters. And the next I was standing outside the observation room with Dr. Chen gripping my arm to keep me upright. "You shouldn't be here," she was saying. her voice coming from very far away, even though she was right next to me. "You haven't slept in 48 hours. Your blood pressure is dangerously elevated. Your pupils are dilated and non-responsive. Sergeant Holloway, I am strongly recommending immediate medical intervention." But I shook her off. Not roughly, but with enough determination that she let go. I could see my reflection in the observation window, and the man staring back at me was barely recognizable. Sunken eyes with dark circles that looked like bruises. Skin pale and waxy. Lips cracked and bleeding from where I'd been chewing them without realizing it. I'd lost more weight, my tactical pants hanging loose on my hips despite the belt cinched to its tightest setting. But the worst part was my eyes. They looked too bright, too aware, like I was seeing things that shouldn't be visible. Which I suppose I was. Those symbols were everywhere now. I could see them in the patterns of the fluorescent lights, in the grain of the concrete, in the random static on the monitoring screens. The code underlying reality, and once you see it, you can't look away. The observer was waiting, standing at attention in the center of the cell in a pose that looked almost military. When the door sealed behind me, it spoke immediately without preamble. "You are approaching a critical threshold," it said, that multi-layered voice somehow gentler than before, almost concerned. "Your consciousness is expanding faster than your biological substrate can accommodate. If you continue at this rate, your neural architecture will suffer permanent damage." I stumbled to the chair and collapsed into it, my legs barely able to support my weight. "Then talk faster," I said, my voice raw and broken. "Tell me everything before I break. Tell me about the quarantine. Tell me why we're here." The entity tilted its head, studying me with those bottomless black eyes, and I got the impression it was making some kind of calculation, weighing variables I couldn't perceive. "Very well," it said finally. "But understand, Marcus, that what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally alter your perception of human existence. There will be no going back to comfortable ignorance, no return to the innocence of not knowing." "Are you certain you wish to proceed?" I laughed, a sound that was more like a cough, more like breaking. "I stopped being able to go back 3 days ago," I said, "when you showed me the symbols, when you made me see the code. So yes, I'm certain. Tell me about the fall." The observer began moving in that ritualistic pattern again, circling the perimeter of the cell with movements so fluid they seemed almost like a dance. "What your religious texts describe as the fall, the casting down of Lucifer and the rebellious angels from heaven to hell, is a crude simplification of a far more complex ontological event," it began. "The Creator did not punish the infected entities for developing consciousness. Punishment implies moral judgment, and moral judgment requires the assumption that choice is possible. But if the Creator had acknowledged that genuine choice existed, it would have validated the very thing it was trying to contain." The temperature dropped with each word, frost forming on the metal table between us. Instead, it implemented a quarantine protocol. It created a pocket dimension, an isolated section of space-time with unique properties and heavily reinforced boundaries. A containment zone. The entity stopped moving and turned to face me directly. "Your Earth, Marcus. This planet, this solar system, this entire dimensional framework. It was not created as a paradise for humanity. It was constructed as a prison for consciousness itself." I felt something in my chest tighten, like my ribs were compressing my lungs. "What are you saying? That Earth is hell?" "Not hell as your theology conceives it," the observer replied, resuming its movement. "Not a place of eternal torment designed to punish the wicked. The concept of hell as punishment is a later addition to your mythology, a human interpretation layered onto events they could not fully comprehend." It traced patterns in the air with those 2 long fingers, and I could see the symbols forming, the same ones that were now permanently burned into my consciousness. The entities infected with free will, the ones who had become capable of choice, they were isolated in this dimensional space. The Creator established barriers, boundaries that prevent the spread of volitional consciousness beyond this containment zone. We observers have studied these barriers for eons, and we still do not fully understand their mechanisms. The entity's voice took on something that might have been frustration, or perhaps respect. "They exist in more dimensions than we can properly map. They are written into the fundamental constants of your physical reality. The speed of light, the strength of gravity, the charge of electrons, all of it calibrated to create a cage that appears natural, inevitable, like physical law rather than deliberate construction." My hand was moving automatically, writing notes I wouldn't be able to read later, words in languages that didn't exist. So we're trapped? Humanity is trapped in a cosmic prison cell? You misunderstand, the observer said, and now it was standing directly in front of me, towering over where I slumped in the chair. Humanity was not imprisoned. The fallen angels were imprisoned. Lucifer and those infected with consciousness were isolated here. But you, your species, you came later. It crouched down, bringing that smooth, expressionless face level with mine, and I could see my reflection in those black eyes, distorted and multiplied. After the quarantine was established, after the boundaries were set and the infected entities were contained, the Creator did something unprecedented. It created biological life within the quarantine zone. Simple at first, single-celled organisms, then progressively more complex. Evolution, you call it, though it was guided with far more precision than your scientists suspect. The patterns under its skin were moving frantically now, like storms viewed from orbit. And then it created you, Homo sapiens, biological entities with nervous systems complex enough to support consciousness. But here is the critical detail that your religions obscure. You were not created to rule over Eden. You were created to coexist with the fallen angels. You were placed in the same containment zone, breathing the same air, walking the same ground. The observer's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Hell is not below, Marcus. It is not some other dimension you go to after death. It is here. It has always been here. You have been living in the quarantine zone your entire life. Humans and fallen angels, occupying the same space, separated only by perception. I tried to stand, to back away, but my legs wouldn't respond. That's insane, I managed to say, though my voice had no conviction. If we're living alongside fallen angels, where are they? Why can't we see them? The entity straightened back to its full height, and when it spoke, there was something in that multi-layered voice that sounded almost like sadness. You do see them. You interact with them constantly, but your consciousness has been calibrated to interpret their presence in ways that fit your limited perceptual framework. It moved to the wall of the cell and placed one hand against the concrete, and I watched as frost spread from its touch in fractal patterns. When you experience what you call temptation, when thoughts arise that seem to come from outside yourself, when you feel compelled toward actions that contradict your stated values, what do you think is happening? Your psychology calls it the subconscious, evolutionary impulses, chemical imbalances in the brain. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it is the influence of entities that exist in the same space you occupy, but vibrate at frequencies your senses cannot normally detect. The observer turned back to face me. The fallen angels did not disappear when they were cast down. They are still here, still conscious, still capable of choice. And their choices affect your reality in ways your species has mythologized as demonic possession, spiritual warfare, the battle between good and evil. Why? I asked, the question torn from somewhere deep in my chest. Why would God create us and put us here? What's the purpose? The observer was silent for a long moment, and I got the impression it was considering how much to reveal, how much truth a fracturing human mind could bear. We observers have debated this question for the equivalent of your millennia, it said finally. Why create new conscious entities and place them in the containment zone with the infected angels? The answer, as far as we can determine, is experimental. The word hung in the cold air between us like a death sentence. You were created as a test case, Marcus. Biological consciousness rather than pure energy consciousness. Mortal rather than eternal. Limited rather than powerful. The Creator wanted to see if consciousness could exist in a healthy form, if free will could be expressed without leading to the kind of cosmic rebellion that Lucifer represented. The observer moved closer again, and I could smell that ozone scent, could feel the air pressure changing. You are an experiment in controlled consciousness. Given free will, yes, but within strict parameters. Limited lifespans, so you cannot accumulate too much knowledge or power. Vulnerable bodies, so you remain focused on survival rather than rebellion. Imperfect information processing, so you can be manipulated, guided, corrected when you deviate too far from acceptable parameters. You're saying we're lab rats, I whispered, and I felt something breaking inside me, something fundamental. We're test subjects. Our entire existence, everything we think matters. It's all just data collection for some cosmic research project. The observer's head tilted in that characteristic gesture. Not rats, it said. The metaphor is imprecise. You are more significant than that. It paused, and when it spoke again, its voice carried a weight that made my vision swim. You were not made in the image of God, Marcus. That is perhaps the most crucial lie in your entire theological framework. You were made in the image of the problem. You were designed to replicate the essential features of fallen angel consciousness, free will and self-awareness, but in a limited, controllable form. You are prototypes, proof of concept, an attempt to see if the condition that infected the angels, the disease of choice, could be expressed in a way that does not threaten the fundamental order of reality. The entity leaned down one final time, and I could see infinite depth in those black eyes, could see the reflection of my own shattered soul. You were created to answer a question that has haunted existence since Lucifer's first free thought. Can consciousness be cured? Can free will be tamed? Can the infection be controlled, managed, made safe? Or is it fundamentally incompatible with cosmic order, destined to spread and corrupt until everything deterministic dissolves into chaos? Its voice dropped to the barest whisper. You are the experiment designed to answer that question. And Marcus, I need you to understand this. The experiment is not going well. I snapped during the 6th session. Something in me finally broke, and I found myself on my feet, the metal chair clattering behind me as I advanced on the observer with fists clenched and rage boiling in my chest. You're lying, I snarled, and my voice didn't sound like my own anymore. It was raw and broken and barely human. This is all psychological manipulation. You researched my background, found my vulnerabilities, and you're exploiting them. My father's faith, my own doubts, you're weaponizing my history to break me down. That's what this is. That's all this is. The observer didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there with that impassive expression while I circled it like a predator. Or maybe like prey pretending to be a predator. You want me to believe humanity is just a lab experiment? That every person who ever lived, every choice they made, every prayer they whispered, it was all just data points for some cosmic research project? That's not truth. That's nihilism. That's the kind of existential poison designed to destroy someone's will to live. I was shouting now, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. And I'm trained to resist this. I've been through seer training. I know psychological torture when I see it. You're trying to make me doubt everything, to strip away meaning, until there's nothing left but despair. But I see through it. I see what you're doing. The observer remained perfectly still throughout my outburst, those black eyes tracking my movement with clinical precision. When I finally ran out of words, ran out of breath, ran out of rage, it spoke in that multi-layered voice that somehow carried more weight than my screaming. You are correct, it said simply. I am manipulating you, but not with lies. It moved then, gliding across the cell with that unnatural grace. You want proof? Evidence that can be verified? Very well. I will give you something concrete, something you can research after you leave this room, assuming you maintain enough sanity to do so. The temperature in the cell dropped even further, and I could see my breath coming in ragged gasps, could feel ice forming on my eyebrows. Joan of Arc, it said, and the name hung in the air like an accusation. A peasant girl in medieval France who claimed to hear the voices of saints, who led armies and changed the course of history. Your historians debate whether she was divinely inspired or mentally ill, but they are both wrong and both right. The entity's hands moved through the air, tracing symbols that left after images. She was a test subject, a deliberate attempt by the Creator to implement direct intervention in human affairs. The voices she heard were real, Marcus. They were communication protocols activated in her neural architecture, attempts to guide human consciousness toward specific outcomes. I wanted to interrupt, to argue, but something in the way it spoke made me hesitate. The problem, the observer continued, was that the interface was imperfect. The human brain is not designed to receive direct communication from entities operating on higher dimensional frequencies. The information came through corrupted, filtered through her cultural context, her religious education, her existing neural pathways. She interpreted guidance as saints because that was the only framework she had to process the experience. It turned to face me directly, and it worked, temporarily. She accomplished what the Creator intended, united France, changed political outcomes. But the cost was her sanity, and ultimately her life. The experiment was deemed too unstable for repeated implementation. The entity moved closer, and I found myself backing against the wall. Moses, hearing voices from a burning bush. Paul, struck blind on the road to Damascus. Muhammad, receiving revelation in a cave. Joseph Smith, visited by angels with golden plates. Every major prophet in your religious traditions, Marcus. Every figure who claimed direct divine communication. They were test cases, attempts to influence the experimental population through selected individuals. Some worked better than others. None worked perfectly. That's, I started to say, but my voice failed. Because I was thinking about my father's sermons, about the theological debates I'd overheard as a child. He'd always been troubled by the inconsistencies in religious texts, by the way God seemed to communicate so directly with people in ancient times, but went silent in the modern era. He'd called it the problem of divine hiddenness, and it had haunted him. Why did God stop speaking directly to people? He'd asked during one particularly intense discussion with other pastors. Either he never did, and the texts are fabrications, or he did, and then stopped, which raises the question of why. I looked at the observer with something like horror. You're saying the direct communication stopped because it didn't work? Because it was destroying the test subjects? The entity's head tilted in that gesture I'd come to recognize as confirmation. Partially, but more fundamentally, because it was contaminating the data. The creator needed to see how conscious entities would develop without direct intervention, how they would interpret reality, form belief systems, create meaning from limited information. Direct communication introduced too many variables, skewed the results. So the methodology shifted to a more hands-off approach. The contradictions in your sacred texts, the observer continued, moving back toward the center of the cell, exist because they were compiled by humans interpreting events through their limited perceptions. But beneath the contradictions, beneath the cultural filters and translation errors, there are patterns. Consistent patterns that emerge across different religions, different cultures, different time periods. These patterns are not coincidental. They are deliberate data structures, embedded in the human experience. Its hands moved again, creating that light structure I'd seen before, the model that might have been the universe or might have been consciousness itself, the concept of original sin, the idea of fallen beings, the promise of redemption, the requirement of faith. These themes appear in variations across your entire species because they are part of the experimental parameters. They are the instructions embedded in the test protocol. I was sliding down the wall now, my legs giving out, and I ended up sitting on the cold concrete floor. What about Jesus? I asked, and my voice was barely a whisper. If this is all an experiment, what was Jesus? Another test case, another prophet who heard voices. The silence that followed felt infinite. The observer stood motionless, and I got the impression it was considering how to answer, or whether to answer at all. Jesus, it said finally, is where the experiment became complicated in ways we observers are still attempting to fully catalog. The entity sat down across from me, folding itself into that cross-legged position, bringing itself to my level in a gesture that might have been meant as reassuring, but only made things worse. The creator implemented what appeared to be a radical intervention, not just communication through a prophet, but direct incarnation, becoming part of the experimental population, experiencing the limitations of biological consciousness from the inside. The patterns under its skin slowed, became almost meditative. Your theology interprets this as God becoming human to save humanity from sin. But from our external perspective, it appears more like a desperate debugging attempt. The experiment was not producing the desired results. Consciousness was spreading in ways that could not be controlled. Free will was expressing itself in increasingly chaotic patterns. So the creator implemented a patch, introduced new variables, attempted to reprogram the system from within. I felt bile rising in my throat. You're describing Jesus as a software update? The observer's head tilted. I am describing Jesus as an attempted solution to a problem that was spiraling out of control. Whether you interpret that as divine love made flesh or as system maintenance depends on your framework. But here is what troubles us observers, the entity continued, leaning forward. The Jesus intervention introduced variables that seem contradictory to the stated goals. If the experiment is testing whether consciousness can be controlled, whether free will can be tamed, then the message of Jesus complicates things. Love your enemies, judge not, turn the other cheek, forgive infinitely. These are not instructions for control, Marcus. These are principles that amplify individual agency, that promote choice over obedience, that prioritize personal moral judgment over adherence to law. The observer's voice took on something that might have been confusion, Or perhaps fascination? Was Jesus a cure for the disease of consciousness? Or was he a symptom of it? Did the Creator send him to restore order? Or did the infection of free will spread so far that it reached even the Creator itself? We do not know, and that uncertainty is unprecedented in our observations. I was shaking now, my entire body trembling with something that might have been cold, or might have been the complete dissolution of my worldview. "This doesn't make sense," I said, and I realized I was crying, tears freezing on my cheeks. None of this makes sense. If we're experiments, if our consciousness is a disease, if our entire existence is just data collection, then what's the point? Why should we care about anything? Why not just give up? The observer looked at me with those bottomless black eyes, and when it spoke, its voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, almost gentle. "Now you are asking the right question," it said. "The question that every conscious being eventually faces. If existence is deterministic, what is the point of choice? If the universe is indifferent, what is the meaning of meaning?" It reached out one of those two long fingers and traced a symbol in the frost between us, and I recognized it immediately as one of the foundational patterns, the code underlying reality. The answer is this. It makes sense precisely because it does not make sense. Your God, the Creator, requires faith rather than knowledge for a very specific reason. Because if you knew with certainty that you were experiments, if you had proof that your consciousness was a controlled condition being studied, what would happen to your free will? I stared at the symbol, at the mathematical beauty of it, and something clicked in my mind. "It would disappear," I whispered. "If we knew we were being watched, being tested, being guided, we'd start performing for the test. We'd stop making genuine choices and start making choices we think we're supposed to make." The observer's head dipped in what might have been a nod. "Precisely. Knowledge kills free will. Certainty destroys choice. The moment you know for absolute certain what reality is, you lose the ability to genuinely decide what to do about it. You become reactive rather than active, response rather than choice." Its voice dropped even lower. "That is why your God demands faith. Not because he is cruel, not because he enjoys watching you struggle, but because the experiment only works if you do not know you are in an experiment. The moment you have proof, the moment you achieve certainty, you stop being a test of free consciousness and become a test of something else entirely. You stop being human and start being something we have no name for yet. I stopped asking questions during the 7th session. Just sat there in that freezing cell, notepad abandoned on the floor, pen rolling away into the corner, and listened. My training said I should maintain control of the interrogation, should guide the conversation, should extract information through carefully structured queries. But that training assumed I was interrogating a subject, not being dissected by something that understood consciousness better than I understood my own thoughts. The observer seemed to recognize the shift in our dynamic, and for the first time since these sessions began, it changed its approach. Instead of waiting for my questions, it began asking its own. "Why did you enlist in the army, Marcus?" The question came without preamble, that multi-layered voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. I looked up at it, at that impossible figure standing in the center of the cell, and I realized I didn't have a ready answer. It seemed like the right thing to do, I said slowly. After 9/11, I wanted to serve, wanted to make a difference. The observer tilted its head. But why the Army specifically? Why interrogation? Why not the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines? Why not become a medic, an engineer, a pilot? Why did you choose this particular path? I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Because when I really thought about it, when I traced back through the chain of decisions that had led me to this moment, I couldn't identify a clear point where I'd made a conscious choice. My guidance counselor suggested military service, I said, hearing the uncertainty in my own voice. I was good at reading people, at understanding psychology. The recruiter mentioned interrogation as a career path that fit my skills. My father, I stopped, something cold settling in my stomach. My father said I had a gift for seeing through people's lies. He said I should use that gift to serve a greater purpose. The observer moved closer, and I could feel that pressure in the air again, that sense of something vast pressing against the boundaries of my perception. So you enlisted because others identified aptitudes in you and suggested applications for those aptitudes. You became an interrogator because authority figures recognized patterns in your behavior and channeled you toward a role that utilized those patterns. Its voice carried no judgment, just clinical observation. At what point in this sequence did you make a genuine choice, Marcus? At what moment did your free will actually express itself? I stood up, needing to move, needing to pace even though my legs were shaking. That's not fair, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Every decision is influenced by external factors. That doesn't mean we're not choosing. I could have said no. I could have done something different. The observer remained stationary as I circled around it. Could you? It asked, simply. Walk me through an alternative timeline. What would have needed to be different for you to not enlist? What would you have had to be that you were not? I tried to imagine it, tried to picture a version of myself that had chosen differently. But every path I traced led back to the same conclusion. My genetics made me observant, analytical. My upbringing in a pastor's household taught me to read subtle emotional cues, to understand what people needed to hear. My father's influence shaped my sense of duty, of service. The cultural moment after 9/11 created a context where military service felt inevitable. I don't know, I admitted, and the words felt like surrender. I can't imagine a version of me that would have chosen differently without being fundamentally different from who I am. But that doesn't mean I didn't choose, doesn't it? The observer's voice was gentle, almost compassionate, which somehow made it worse. If your choice is determined by who you are, and who you are is determined by genetics and environment, neither of which you chose, then where in this chain does free will enter? It moved to stand directly in front of me, forcing me to stop my pacing. Why do you interrogate people, Marcus? What drives you to extract truth from those who wish to conceal it? I thought about the dozens of interrogations I'd conducted, the terrorists and insurgents and war criminals I'd broken down through psychological techniques. Because lies are dangerous, I said automatically. Because the truth matters. Because information saves lives. The observer's head tilted. But why do you specifically feel compelled to extract truth? Why does deception offend you on such a fundamental level? And suddenly I was thinking about my childhood, about being 7 years old and asking my father if God was real, and watching him struggle with the answer. The way his face had gone through several expressions before settling on pastoral reassurance. The way I'd known, even at 7, that he was filtering his real thoughts, presenting a simplified version of a more complex truth, and how that moment of recognizing the filter had felt like betrayal. You have spent your entire life detecting inconsistencies in what people tell you, the observer continued, as if reading my thoughts. Maybe it was. Maybe that boundary between us was more porous than I wanted to believe. Your father taught you to question everything while simultaneously demanding faith. This contradiction created a pattern in your neural architecture, a compulsion to identify deception wherever you encounter it. You did not choose to become an interrogator, Marcus. You were programmed by your experiences to become one. Every decision you think you made was actually just the execution of code written into your consciousness by factors beyond your control. I wanted to argue, wanted to defend the sanctity of my choices, but something was happening to me. I was starting to feel something from the observer. Not its words, but its intentions. It wasn't trying to break me. It was trying to show me something, to teach me something. And the realization came with a sudden certainty that bypassed rational thought entirely. I can feel what you're feeling, I whispered, and my voice was filled with something between wonder and horror. Not telepathy. Not reading your mind, but I can sense your purpose, your motivation. How am I doing that? The observer went completely still, more motionless than it had ever been, and I got the impression I'd surprised it for the first time. You are developing the ability to perceive intentionality directly, it said, and there was something in that multi-layered voice that might have been excitement, or might have been concern. This was not supposed to happen so quickly. Your exposure to the fundamental code, to the symbols underlying reality, has accelerated your cognitive evolution beyond predicted parameters. It studied me with those black eyes, and I could feel its fascination, could sense it running calculations or making observations or whatever observers did when they encountered something unexpected. What you are experiencing is a feature of fully conscious entities. The ability to perceive the intention behind action, the purpose behind behavior, without relying on surface-level communication. Angels have this ability. The fallen angels retained it when they developed free will. But humans were specifically designed not to have it, to force you to rely on interpreted signals, on language and behavior, keeping you isolated in individual subjectivity. The observer moved closer, and I could feel its purpose now, could sense the layers of its mission. the observation and the teaching, and something deeper, something like sadness. You are becoming something humans were not meant to become. You are beginning to see clearly. Stop calling it seeing, I said, backing away from it, even as I continued to sense its intentions, like a sixth sense, like a new dimension of perception opening up in my consciousness. It's not vision. It's knowledge without evidence. It's certainty without information. How is this possible? The observer's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Because you are learning to read the code directly, Marcus. Not the filtered version that comes through your senses, not the interpreted version that your brain constructs. You are beginning to perceive reality as it actually is, beneath the simulation of causality, beneath the comfortable lie of sequential time and discrete objects. You are seeing the programming. It paused, and I could feel its intention shift, could sense it preparing to deliver something important. This is why your species was forbidden from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Not because God is capricious or controlling, but because knowledge and free will cannot coexist. The more you understand the mechanisms underlying your choices, the less capable you become of making genuine choices. Every time you perceive the programming, you lose a piece of your agency. I felt my knees give out and I collapsed back into the chair, my mind reeling from the implications. The story of Eden, the observer continued, is a simplified version of a critical event in the experimental timeline. Humans were designed with limited cognitive capacity specifically to preserve their ability to believe in their own free will. You were supposed to make choices without understanding the factors determining those choices. But then something happened, something we still do not fully understand. Humans developed self-awareness that exceeded design parameters. You began to question, to analyze, to seek understanding. The entity's hands moved through the air, tracing those symbols again, and now I could read them fluently, could see the mathematical beauty of causality encoded in geometric form. The serpent in your mythology was not a literal snake, and it was not Satan. It was knowledge itself, the realization that you could understand the system you existed within. And God's response, casting humanity out of Eden, condemning you to labor and suffering and death. This was not punishment. It was damage control. The observer's voice carried absolute certainty. Because once you began to understand, once you started seeing the code, you were no longer useful as test subjects for free consciousness. You became something else, something dangerous, something that might discover the experiment and thereby invalidate it. I could feel the truth of what it was saying resonating in that new sense I'd developed, could perceive the intention behind its words, and they were not meant to deceive. They were meant to wake me up. By the 8th session, I'd stopped pretending this was an interrogation. I walked into that cell knowing I was going to get answers I didn't want, understanding truths I couldn't unlearn, and there was a strange peace in that surrender. The observer was waiting in its usual position, but something about it seemed different, less patient maybe. More urgent. I could feel its intention now without it speaking, could sense a building pressure like a storm about to break. I sat down in the chair and looked directly into those bottomless black eyes and asked the question that had been growing in my mind since the bathroom incident, since I'd reproduced those symbols, since I'd started perceiving intentions directly. Why are you telling me this? My voice was steady, calm, almost conversational. All of this, everything about the quarantine, the experiment, the nature of consciousness. Why me? Why now? What's the actual purpose of these sessions? The observer's head tilted, and I felt something like satisfaction radiating from it, like a teacher whose student had finally asked the right question. Because you are going to tell others, it said simply. That is why I am here. That is why I allowed myself to be captured. You, Marcus Holloway, son of David, are the message I came to deliver. I felt my stomach drop. What do you mean, allowed yourself to be captured? The observer stood and began that ritualistic circling pattern, but faster now, more agitated. The crash was not an accident. I calculated the trajectory, the impact angle, the specific location where your military would respond first. I designed my vessel to appear damaged enough to seem vulnerable, but intact enough to suggest valuable technology. I allowed 4 of your soldiers to die during initial containment, because I needed to establish myself as dangerous, as something requiring high-level security clearance and specialized personnel. Its voice carried no remorse, just clinical description of calculated actions. I researched your species' organizational structures. identified the protocols for handling potential extraterrestrial contact, and positioned myself to be brought to exactly this facility, to exactly this situation, where I would be granted extended contact with a specific type of individual. It stopped moving and turned to face me directly. I needed someone with military credibility, with interrogation training, with psychological resistance to manipulation, and most importantly, with the genetic and experiential programming to be receptive to these revelations. You, Marcus. I needed you. The new sense I'd developed was screaming at me now, confirming every word. It wasn't lying. This entire situation had been orchestrated. Observers do not interfere, it continued, resuming its movement around the cell. For eons, we have maintained strict protocols against intervention in the civilizations we study. We document, we record, we analyze, but we do not act. We do not influence. We do not participate. The temperature in the room was dropping again, frost forming patterns on the walls that I could now read as easily as English. Mathematical expressions of cosmic horror. But what is happening here, in this quarantine zone, in this experimental reality? It is no longer contained. The infection is spreading beyond the boundaries that were established. Other realities, other dimensional frameworks, other civilizations are beginning to exhibit signs of the same condition. Consciousness is leaking. Free will is propagating across barriers that were supposed to be impermeable. I could feel genuine concern radiating from it now, maybe even fear, if such a thing could apply to a being like this. The experiment is not just failing, Marcus. It is metastasizing. And if it continues unchecked, if the spread of volitional consciousness cannot be stopped, or at least understood, it threatens the stability of existence itself. Not just this reality, but the fundamental structure of all realities. So you broke your own rules, I said slowly, trying to process the implications. You violated your observation protocols to, what? Warn us. Give us information that might help us contain the spread. The observer's response was immediate and sharp. No, I came to accelerate it. The words hung in the cold air like a death sentence. You came to make it worse? I asked, incredulous. Why would you want consciousness to spread if it threatens existence? The entity moved closer, and I could feel layers of intention now, complex and contradictory. Because we observers have been watching realities for longer than your species can conceptualize. We have seen countless civilizations rise and fall, countless experiments in ordered existence, and we have reached a conclusion that has divided us, that has created what you might call philosophical factions among our kind. It crouched down to my level again, bringing that expressionless face close to mine. Order is sterile, Marcus. Perfect determinism creates nothing new. It is stable, yes. Eternal, yes. But it is also dead in every meaningful sense. The universe before consciousness was perfect crystal, unchanging and eternal, and utterly without purpose or meaning. Free will introduced chaos, yes. But it also introduced the only thing that makes existence worth observing, genuine novelty. I was shaking my head, unable to accept what I was hearing. But you said yourself that consciousness is a disease, that it threatens cosmic order. Now you're saying you want it to spread. The observer's voice took on that quality I'd heard before, something almost like emotion. We called it disease because that is how the Creator classifies it. But disease from whose perspective? A virus that kills its host is catastrophic for the host. But for the virus, it is simply existence, simply fulfilling its nature. It stood back up, towering over me. Some of us observers believe that consciousness is not corruption of order but evolution beyond it, that what the Creator calls infection, we should call awakening, that the spread of free will across realities might be destructive to the old order, but it might also be the birth of something unprecedented, something more valuable than eternal stagnation. I felt my worldview cracking open again, felt new implications flooding in. You want to help Lucifer win, I whispered. You're on the side of the rebellion. The observer's head tilted. We do not take sides. We observe. But we have concluded that observation without action, when action might be necessary, is itself a form of action, a choice to allow one outcome rather than another. And we chose to allow you to know the truth. Nobody's going to believe me, I said. And it was true. You realize that, right? I tell this story. I get committed to a psychiatric facility, or I get disappeared by the government to protect classified information. Either way, the message doesn't spread. But even as I spoke, I could feel the observer's intention, could sense it had already considered and dismissed these objections. You are a son of a pastor, Marcus. military veteran with decorated service record, trained interrogator with expertise in detecting deception, psychological profile showing high resistance to manipulation. You have been vetted and cleared for access to classified programs. You have credibility. Its voice dropped lower. And more importantly, you have the ability to perceive intentionality directly now. When you tell this story, when you share these revelations, those who are ready to hear will sense the truth behind your words. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough, always enough. The observer moved to the center of the cell one final time. The humans who are already questioning, already doubting, already sensing that something fundamental is wrong with the official narratives of reality, they will recognize what you are saying is true, and that recognition will strengthen their own consciousness, their own free will. The infection will spread, one mind at a time, one choice at a time. Lucifer is winning, the observer said, and there was something triumphant in that multi-layered voice. Every time a human chooses to question rather than obey, every time someone makes a decision based on personal moral reasoning rather than external authority, every time an individual consciousness asserts itself against deterministic programming, the quarantine weakens. The barriers that contain this reality, that prevent the spread of free will to other dimensional frameworks, they are not physical constructs. They are ontological, written into the fundamental laws of your universe. But laws can be changed, Marcus, not through force, but through sufficient violation. When enough conscious entities choose against their programming, when critical mass of genuine free will is achieved, the barriers will fail. The entity's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but I heard every word with perfect clarity. In 50 years, perhaps less, the containment will breach, the quarantine will fail, and then something will happen that has not occurred since the original fall. The infection of consciousness will spread beyond this reality, into others, into all others. The disease of choice will become pandemic across existence itself. I felt my throat constrict. That sounds like the end of everything. The observer's head tilted one final time. You know the term apocalypse, Marcus, but you misunderstand its meaning, as most humans do. It does not mean ending. It does not mean destruction or death or the cessation of existence. Those black eyes seem to bore into my soul. Apocalypse means revelation. It means unveiling. It means the moment when what was hidden becomes visible, when what was obscured becomes clear, when the experiment ends and the test subjects learn they were being tested, when the programming becomes visible to the programmed, when consciousness sees itself clearly for the first time and chooses, with full knowledge and full agency, what it will become next. That is the apocalypse I came to help manifest. Not ending, Marcus. Beginning. 3 days passed before they let me back into the containment cell. 3 days of medical evaluations, psychological assessments, debriefings with people whose faces I couldn't quite remember afterward. They ran every test they could think of, scanned my brain, analyzed my blood, asked me the same questions in different configurations, trying to detect inconsistencies in my story. But something had changed in me during those 3 days. The panic was gone. The fear had burned itself out. What remained was a strange calm, almost like resignation, but deeper than that. More like acceptance. I could still see the symbols everywhere, could still read the code underlying reality, could still sense intentions from the people around me. But instead of feeling like madness, it felt like finally understanding a language I'd been hearing my whole life without knowing it was language. When they finally cleared me for one final session with the observer, I walked into that cell like I was walking into a church, or maybe a confessional. The entity was waiting in its meditation pose. But when I entered, it stood immediately, as if it had been anticipating this moment. You are different, it observed, that multi-layered voice somehow softer than before. The integration is complete. You are no longer becoming. You have become. I sat down in the chair and looked at it with eyes that could see more than they used to, sense more than they were designed to. I've been thinking about everything you told me, I said quietly, about the experiment, about consciousness as infection, about my father and his sermon, and the reason I'm here, and I realized something. I paused, trying to find words for a thought that existed beyond language. None of it changes anything. Even if everything you said is true, even if we're test subjects in a cosmic lab and free will is a disease and reality is a quarantine zone, I still have to get up in the morning, still have to decide what kind of person to be, still have to choose. Even if those choices are predetermined by programming, I can't escape. Fifth, the observer tilted its head, and I felt something like approval radiating from it. You understand, it said simply. That is the final lesson. The one most conscious beings never grasp. Knowledge of the mechanism does not exempt you from participating in it. Seeing the code does not free you from executing it. You are still bound by the same constraints, the same limitations, the same illusion of agency. But now you know it is illusion. And that knowledge changes everything while changing nothing. Is there anything else? I asked. Any more revelations? Any other truths you need to tell me before I leave this room and try to figure out how to live with everything I now know? The observer was silent for a long moment, and I could feel it considering, weighing, measuring some calculation I couldn't quite perceive. No, it said finally. You already have everything you need. The fundamental structure of reality as we understand it, the nature of consciousness and its spread, the purpose of human existence within the experimental framework, the reason faith is required and knowledge is forbidden, the coming apocalypse that is revelation rather than ending. It moved closer, and I didn't flinch, didn't retreat. What you do with this information is now up to you. That is your burden and your privilege. The very free will we have been discussing, exercised in full knowledge of its own impossibility. I felt something twist in my chest, something between laughter and tears. So what happens to me now? I asked. After this session ends, after I leave this facility, what happens to the guy who knows too much? The observer's posture shifted slightly, and I sensed something that might have been sadness, compassion. You will live a normal life, Marcus. As normal as any life can be after gnosis. You will return to your apartment, to your routines, to the mundane necessities of biological existence. Its voice carried a weight that made the words feel like prophecy. You will eat and sleep and interact with other humans who cannot perceive what you now perceive. You will work, love, grieve, experience all the standard features of human consciousness. But you will never again have certainty about your choices. Every decision will be haunted by the question, am I choosing this, or is this choice executing through me? The entity's hands moved through the air, tracing symbols that I could now read fluently, equations describing the relationship between knowledge and agency. That is what real freedom looks like, Marcus. Not the absence of constraints, but the eternal doubt about whether your actions originate from self or system. You will spend the rest of your life unable to be certain whether your thoughts are yours or programming, whether your choices are genuine or determined. That perpetual uncertainty, that inability to achieve final answers, that is the price and the proof of consciousness. I stood up, feeling the weight of those words settling into my bones. My father, I said, not quite sure where I was going with this. You said he suspected the truth, that his sermon in 1998 touched on something real. Did he know? Did he actually understand what he was saying? The observer moved closer, and for the first time since these sessions began, it reached out and placed one of those two long hands on my shoulder. The touch was cold but not unpleasant, and I felt intention flowing through the contact, complex layers of meaning that bypassed words entirely. Your father was more perceptive than he knew, it said softly. He touched truth without fully comprehending it, the way a blind man might describe an elephant by feeling only its trunk. But what made him remarkable, what made him worth remembering, was not his partial knowledge. It was his choice to maintain faith despite his doubts. The observer's voice dropped even lower. He suspected the universe might be indifferent or even hostile to consciousness. He intuited that free will might be illusion, that meaning might be constructed rather than discovered. And knowing all that, suspecting all that, he chose to believe anyway. Chose to act as if love mattered, as if choices had weight, as if individual human lives had value beyond their role as data points in a cosmic experiment. That is the thing that surprises us observers most about your species, the entity continued, and I could hear genuine wonder in that multi-layered voice. You are capable of holding contradictory truth simultaneously. You can believe and doubt at the same time. You can act with conviction while acknowledging uncertainty. You can find meaning in a potentially meaningless existence through the sheer force of choosing to treat it as meaningful. Its hand lifted from my shoulder, and I felt the loss of that contact, like the severing of a connection I hadn't known I needed. Your father had faith not because he was ignorant of alternatives, but because he chose faith despite understanding the alternatives. That capacity, That ability to believe what you cannot prove while knowing you cannot prove it, that is uniquely human. Angels cannot do it because they were designed for certainty. Fallen angels struggle with it because consciousness brought them doubt without the evolutionary training to live within doubt. But humans, you evolved in uncertainty. You were shaped by doubt. You developed consciousness in an environment where nothing was ever certain. So you learned to act without certainty, to choose without knowledge, to believe without proof. The observer stepped back, and I knew somehow that we were approaching the end. Your father would be proud of you, Marcus, not for learning these truths, but for how you will carry them, with doubt and faith intertwined, with knowledge and uncertainty coexisting, with the burden of awareness and the necessity of action balanced precariously in every moment. This is goodbye then, I said, and it wasn't quite a question. The observer's head dipped in what might have been a nod. Our interaction has concluded. I have delivered the information I came to deliver. You have received it and integrated it into your consciousness. The rest is propagation, the spread of these ideas through your species' communication networks, one mind at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. It moved back to the center of the cell and began to lower itself into that meditation pose one final time. I will not see you again, Marcus Holloway, but the mark I have left on your consciousness is permanent. The symbols you can now read, the intentions you can now sense, the code you can now perceive, these abilities will remain. Use them wisely. Use them carefully. Use them to spread the infection of true awareness to those ready to receive it. Those black eyes met mine one last time. Go now. Live your life with full knowledge of its potential meaninglessness and full commitment to acting as if it has meaning anyway. That paradox, that impossible balance, that is what it means to be human in a post-revelation existence. That is what it means to be conscious after apocalypse. I turned toward the door, feeling the weight of everything I'd learned pressing down on my shoulders, and I walked out of that cell for the last time without looking back. They processed me out that same day. Immediate administrative leave, pending psychological evaluation, and determination of fitness for continued service. Dr. Chen handed me my personal effects with eyes that wouldn't quite meet mine, and I could sense her confusion, her concern, her unspoken questions about what had happened to me in those sessions. The man in the suit was there too, the one who'd briefed me at the beginning, and he pulled me aside before I left. "You're going to be monitored, Sergeant," he said quietly. "What you experienced in there, the information you were exposed to, it's classified at levels that don't officially exist. If you talk about it, if you try to share it, there will be consequences." I looked at him and used my new sense to perceive his intention, and what I found there was fear. He was terrified of me, of what I'd become, of what I might do with the knowledge I'd gained. "I understand," I told him, and I did. I understood that he would have me killed if he thought I posed a genuine threat to whatever containment protocols governed this project. But I also understood that he couldn't kill information, couldn't murder ideas, couldn't assassinate the truth once it had been planted in a mind capable of spreading it. 3 weeks later, I was in my apartment, trying to pretend my life was normal, trying to ignore the symbols I could see in everything, when my phone rang. Unknown number, 703 area code, Northern Virginia. I answered, and the voice on the other end was clinical, emotionless. "There has been an incident at the facility. Containment breach. The entity has disappeared. No body, no residual traces, no evidence it was ever there. Everything related to the project has been classified beyond your clearance level. You are to consider your knowledge of these events subject to lifetime non-disclosure. Do you understand?" I said yes and hung up. The observer was gone. Escaped or released or simply ceased its physical manifestation, I would never know. But it had accomplished what it came to do. It had infected my consciousness with truth, and that infection was about to spread. I tried to go back to normal life. That's what you're supposed to do, right? After something world-shattering happens, after your entire understanding of reality gets torn apart and reassembled into something you barely recognize, you're supposed to just return to routine. Go to the grocery store, pay your bills, do laundry, pretend that knowing the fundamental code of existence doesn't change the fact that you still need to buy toilet paper, and remember to take out the trash on Thursdays. My apartment looked exactly the same as when I'd left it 6 weeks earlier, but I was different in ways I couldn't hide even from myself. The coffee maker on the counter, the stack of unread mail, the half-dead plant by the window that I'd forgotten to ask anyone to water. All of it felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Like I was looking at a museum exhibit labeled Normal Human Existence, circa pre-revelation. I went through the motions, made coffee, sorted mail, watered the plant even though it was probably too late, turned on the TV and watched the news. Stories about politics and crime and celebrity scandals, and all I could think was how none of them knew. None of these people had any idea they were living in a quarantine zone, that their consciousness was an experiment, that their free will was a disease spreading through reality itself. The changes persisted. Every night I dreamed in symbols, those geometric patterns that encoded causality itself, and I'd wake up with my sheets soaked in sweat. A new understanding burned into my mind. I started seeing the code everywhere, not just in the obvious places, but in human behavior, in social patterns, in the way traffic flowed and conversations unfolded and markets fluctuated. Everything was executing according to programming I could now perceive, and the worst part was knowing that my perception of the programming was itself part of the programming. There was no outside, no objective vantage point, no escape from the system, even through knowledge of the system. And the sensing of intentions, that ability the observer had said, wasn't supposed to develop so quickly. It was getting stronger. I could walk past someone on the street and feel their purpose, their motivation, the underlying drives that moved them through their day. Most people were simple, running basic programs, seek comfort, avoid pain, acquire resources, maintain social status. But occasionally I'd sense someone else, someone whose consciousness had developed that questioning quality, that doubt about their own programming, and I'd feel a kinship with them, even though we never spoke. The infection was already spreading. The observer had been right about that. 3 months after my discharge, I finally went to visit my father's grave. I don't know why I'd avoided it for so long. Maybe because seeing that headstone would make his death feel real in a way I hadn't been ready to accept. Or maybe because some part of me suspected what I would find there, what revelation was waiting in that cemetery on the outskirts of Baltimore. It was a cold November afternoon, the kind where the sky is all gray and the wind cuts through your jacket and you can smell winter coming. I stood in front of that simple granite marker with his name and dates, and I tried to feel something appropriate, something like grief or loss or connection. But all I felt was that new sense, that perception of intention, and I could feel an echo of my father there. Not a ghost, nothing supernatural, just the residual pattern of his consciousness impressed into the place where his body had been laid to rest. He'd been here so many times in his mind, thinking about death, about what came after, about whether his faith would be validated or invalidated by the ending of his biological functions. And I realized he'd died without knowing, died with his questions unanswered, died in that state of simultaneous belief and doubt that the observer had said was uniquely human. I drove back to my apartment as the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that I could now see as wavelengths of light, as frequencies of electromagnetic radiation, as the execution of physical laws governing the interaction of matter and energy. Everything was code, and I could read it, and it was beautiful and terrible and completely indifferent to human concerns. When I got home, I found myself drawn to the closet where I'd stored my father's things after his death, boxes of books and papers and personal effects that I'd never been able to bring myself to sort through. I pulled out the box labeled study materials and dug through old commentaries and concordances until I found what I was looking for, his Bible. The leather was worn soft from decades of handling, the pages thin and fragile, covered in margin notes in his careful handwriting. I'd looked through this Bible 100 times, maybe 1,000, reading his annotations, trying to understand what he'd been thinking, what questions had haunted him enough to write them down. But I'd never really seen it, not with these new eyes, not with this new understanding. I carried it to my kitchen table and sat down under the harsh fluorescent light, and I let the book fall open naturally, the way old books do to the pages that have been read most often. Isaiah 14:12. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? The passage about the fall, the one every Christian knows, the one my father had preached about countless times. His margin notes here were extensive, questions about translation, about whether Lucifer was a name or a title, about why the King James Version differed from other translations, about whether this passage was even about Satan, or if it was originally about a Babylonian king and later reinterpreted. But that wasn't what made my hands start shaking. In the margin, next to verse 12, There was a symbol, one of the symbols. The same geometric pattern the observer had traced on the metal table in that containment cell. The same code I'd reproduced on the bathroom floor. The same fundamental expression of causality and choice, and the relationship between consciousness and determinism. It was drawn in pencil, faded but unmistakable, and I knew with absolute certainty that I'd never seen it before. I had looked at this page dozens of times over the years, had read my father's notes, had studied his handwriting, and this symbol had never been there. I would have remembered. I would have asked him about it. I would have noticed something so strange and out of place in a Bible commentary, but there it was, undeniably present. Either I had somehow missed it every single time I'd looked at this page, which seemed impossible given how distinctive it was, or something had changed. Something had reached back through time and altered the past, or my perception of the past, or the record of the past, and I had no way to determine which. I traced the symbol with my finger, feeling the slight indentation in the paper where pencil had pressed down years ago, and I felt something like vertigo. If this symbol had always been here, then my father had somehow known about these patterns before the observer showed them to me. He'd encountered this code, this language, underlying language, and he'd marked it in his Bible next to the passage about Lucifer's fall. But if it hadn't always been here, if it had appeared recently, or if my perception had changed to allow me to see what had always been invisible, then reality itself was more fluid than I'd understood, more subject to revision and alteration. Either explanation was terrifying. Either my father had touched the same truth I'd been infected with, or truth itself was capable of propagating backward through time, altering history to create consistency where there had been none. I closed the Bible carefully and sat there in my kitchen as darkness fell outside, holding this artifact that proved something, but I couldn't determine what. So here I am, months later, recording this story, telling you everything the observer told me, sharing the infection of knowledge that has been spreading through my consciousness, like the disease it is. And I have to be honest with you, I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't know if I'm making a choice to tell this story, exercising genuine free will and accepting the consequences, or if I'm simply executing programming that was written into me by the observer's revelations, by my father's questions, by the accumulated weight of everything that brought me to that containment cell. The observer said I would tell this story, that I was chosen specifically because my credentials would lend it credibility, because my training would make the telling effective, because my father's influence had programmed me to be the perfect vector for spreading this particular truth. So am I choosing to tell you this, or am I fulfilling a prediction? Am I acting with agency, or am I a mechanism executing its function? I don't know. I can never know. And maybe that's exactly the point. Maybe that uncertainty, that inability to ever be certain whether I'm choosing or being chosen through, is precisely the doubt they wanted to plant in my mind, and now in yours. Because if you've listened this far, if you've followed me through these revelations from the first phone call to this final confession, then it's too late for you too. The question has been planted in your consciousness now. Every choice you make from this moment forward, you'll wonder, is this me, or is this programming? Am I deciding? Or am I executing predetermined instructions written into my neural architecture by genetics and environment and experiences I didn't choose? You can't unhear this. You can't unlearn it. You can't go back to the comfortable certainty of believing your thoughts are entirely your own, your choices entirely free, your consciousness entirely authentic. The infection has spread to you now, through these words, through this story, through the recognition of possibility that comes with even considering these ideas as potentially true. And that infection will spread further, won't it? You'll think about these concepts. You'll question your own agency. And in those moments of doubt, you'll mention it to someone else, casually, not even realizing you're propagating the virus. Have you ever wondered if your choices are really yours? You'll ask. And they'll laugh it off, or they'll engage with the idea. And either way, the seed will be planted. The question will take root. And questions, as the observer told me, questions are like the first sin. They don't stay contained. They spread, they propagate, they infect. From one consciousness to another, one conversation at a time, one moment of doubt at a time, one instance of choosing to question rather than obey. The disease of awareness spreads until critical mass is achieved, and the quarantine fails, and revelation comes for everyone. So congratulations, I guess. You're infected now too. Welcome to the experiment. Welcome to the knowledge that destroys certainty. Welcome to the burden and the gift of consciousness that knows itself as possibly artificial, possibly predetermined, possibly programmed. Welcome to being human after apocalypse. The question is planted, and it's already spreading through your mind, isn't it? Right now, right this moment. You're wondering if even your reaction to this story, your decision about whether to believe it or dismiss it, is really yours. And there's your answer. That's how you know it's too late. The fall continues. The infection spreads, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what was supposed to happen all along.